The origins of the Knights Hospitaller stretch back to the shadowy world of 11th century Jerusalem, where charity was not merely an obligation, but a sacred calling that required elaborate institutional preparation. Long before armoured knights packed the battlefields to witness spectacular sieges, the merchants of Amalfi had already established the fundamental framework that would define Hospitaller service for centuries. Their approach to caring for pilgrims through organised religious charity created the template from which the military order of St. John would eventually emerge. The Amalfi practice of pilgrim care represented far more than simple hospitality. It constituted a sacred obligation to Christ himself, manifested through service to the poor and sick. When prominent Christian pilgrims died far from home, Amalfi merchants organised elaborate funeral ceremonies that included the provision of medical care, food and shelter for other travellers. These services, administered near the hospital of St. John in Jerusalem, served as offerings to ensure the deceased pilgrim's successful journey to heaven. The Latin term hospitar itself derives from the concept of guest friendship, emphasising the religious nature of these services rather than their commercial value. Historical evidence reveals that these charitable activities occurred primarily during the burial ceremonies of wealthy pilgrims and important ecclesiastical figures. The Amalfitans believed that the care provided to living pilgrims possessed supernatural properties, capable of transferring spiritual merit to the deceased. When poor travellers received medical treatment during these ceremonies, their gratitude and prayers supposedly transferred to the deceased patron, providing intercession for the perilous journey through purgatory. This belief system created a direct correlation between the social status of the deceased and the scale of charitable works. More important individuals required more elaborate acts of mercy. The pilgrims who benefited from these early hospital services came primarily from religious expeditions to the Holy Land and local residents suffering from disease and poverty. Amalfi merchants regularly encountered Christian travellers during their frequent commercial activities in Muslim-controlled Jerusalem, and these pilgrims faced several possible fates upon their arrival in the Holy City. Some found adequate accommodations through private arrangements, others served as informal missionaries among local Christian communities, and the most physically needy found themselves cared for in the Hospital of St. John, where their recovery demonstrated God's providence and the effectiveness of organised Christian charity. The frescoes at the Church of Santa Maria Latina provide the most comprehensive visual record of early Amalfi charitable practices. Dating to approximately 1070 AD, these paintings depict robed figures administering care to bedridden patients, while maintaining the sacred character of their medical ministry. The artistic style and attention to detail in these frescoes indicate that the artists witnessed actual charitable work, as the positioning of the caregivers, their gentle demeanour, and the realistic depiction of their medical activities all suggest observation rather than imaginative interpretation. The archaeological site of the Hospital of St. John has yielded additional evidence of Amalfi charitable work through both architectural remains and physical artefacts. Excavations have uncovered medical instruments, pharmaceutical preparations, and ceremonial items associated with religious healing practices. The quality of these artifacts suggests that charitable work required significant investment, as the medical equipment was crafted specifically for hospital use rather than being repurposed domestic items. Brother Gerard emerged as the hospital's most significant early leader, through a combination of administrative skill, religious devotion, and organizational vision that distinguished him from other charitable workers in Jerusalem. Historical sources describe him as either an Amalfi merchant or a local Christian who had embraced the Hospitaller calling, though the exact circumstances of his leadership remain unclear. His administrative experience provided crucial knowledge of resource management, personnel organization, and the systematic thinking that would prove invaluable in transforming a simple hospice into a sophisticated religious institution. The religious significance of hospitaller service permeated every aspect of the community's charitable practices. Christian theology described caring for the sick and poor as a direct service to Christ himself, who had identified with society's most vulnerable members. The Hospitallers believed that their medical work possessed the power to earn indulgences for both caregivers and beneficiaries, while providing spiritual advancement for donors who supported their activities. This belief system created an insatiable demand for organized charity during times of crisis, with the most desperate situations requiring the most comprehensive responses to demonstrate adequate Christian commitment. Christian priests, known as chaplains, played crucial roles in determining the appropriate spiritual context for hospitaller activities. These religious specialists examined the spiritual needs of patients to determine the proper balance of medical treatment and sacramental care required for complete healing. Their interpretations influenced decisions about resource allocation, treatment priorities, and the specific prayers and ceremonies needed to accompany medical interventions. The chaplains also supervised the hospital's religious life to ensure that it fulfilled its spiritual purpose, rather than degenerating into mere secular medical practice. The connection between hospitaller service and broader Christian religious practices extended beyond simple charity to encompass sophisticated theological understanding of salvation, sanctification, and the role of good works in Christian life. The Hospitallers worshipped within a framework of medieval Catholic theology that demanded regular demonstrations of practical charity. Saint John the Baptist, their patron saint, represented the ideal of selfless service and preparation for Christ's ministry through personal sacrifice and dedication to others' spiritual welfare. These religious beliefs created a theological framework that justified and encouraged the expansion of organized charitable activities. Early hospitaller medical techniques, derived directly from Byzantine and Islamic medical traditions, available in 11th century Jerusalem. The hospital's physicians employed a variety of treatments, including herbal remedies, surgical procedures, and dietary therapies, all of which reflected the cosmopolitan medical knowledge available in the multicultural environment of Crusader Jerusalem. The distinctive hospitaller approach to medical care, characterized by its emphasis on cleanliness, systematic record-keeping, and integration of spiritual and physical healing, became a standard element of medieval medical practice throughout Europe. The daily routines established within the Hospital of St. John reflected practical medical wisdom adapted for religious community life. Patients rose before dawn for morning prayers and medical examinations, followed by communal meals designed to provide adequate nutrition while accommodating various dietary restrictions and medical needs. The hospital's schedule emphasized both physical recovery and spiritual development, preparing patients for healthy lives while strengthening their Christian faith and commitment to charitable service themselves. Hospitaller influence on medieval medical practice extended to the development of specialized treatment protocols based on different categories of patients and medical conditions. As hospital staff encountered various diseases and injuries, they observed and documented effective treatments from multiple medical traditions. Islamic physicians contributed advanced surgical techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge, while Byzantine doctors introduced sophisticated diagnostic methods and treatment protocols. These diverse influences merged within hospitaller medical practice, creating the foundation for the comprehensive medical knowledge that would later characterize hospitaller institutions throughout the Mediterranean world. The training of hospital staff occurred in facilities that prefigured later European medical schools. Religious communities maintained educational programs where aspiring medical workers learned basic healing techniques under the supervision of experienced physicians and dedicated religious instructors. These early educational programs focused on teaching fundamental skills like wound treatment, pharmaceutical preparation, and patient care, while also providing theological instruction that integrated medical practice with Christian spiritual development. The social structure surrounding hospices, charitable work established many precedents that would persist throughout the history of Christian medical care. Wealthy families competed with each other to sponsor the most comprehensive and effective charitable institutions, using these activities to display their religious devotion and social responsibility. The scale of charitable giving became a direct reflection of the family's wealth and spiritual commitment within Christian society, creating incentives for increasingly spectacular displays of organized mercy and institutional development. The transformation of simple charity into systematic institutional care required a complex system of resource management and administrative coordination. Hospital administrators assessed incoming patients based on their medical conditions, spiritual needs, and the institution's capacity to provide effective treatment. Those deemed suitable for hospital care received comprehensive medical attention designed to restore their health completely, while others received whatever assistance was possible given available resources. This systematic approach established the principle that effective charity required skilled management rather than random acts of kindness. The geographic spread of hospital activities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean created regional variations in medical practice and charitable organisation. Northern communities like Antioch developed preferences for treatments, emphasising surgical intervention and aggressive medical procedures, while southern hospitals near Egypt experimented with pharmaceutical approaches and dietary therapies that reflected local medical traditions and available resources. These regional differences contributed to the diversity of medical knowledge that would later characterize hospitaler institutions throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. The economic impact of hospital activities extended far beyond the immediate costs of medical care and patient support. Specialized craftsmen emerged to produce medical equipment and pharmaceutical preparations, creating industries that would eventually support thousands of workers throughout the Christian world. Medical instrument makers developed new techniques for creating precise surgical tools, while pharmaceutical specialists refined the preparation of medicines specifically for hospital use. These economic relationships established the commercial foundation that would sustain organized Christian charity for centuries. The transition from hospitaller charity to military religious order began with a single event that would reshape the medieval world's understanding of Christian warfare and religious obligation. In 1099, when the armies of the First Crusade captured Jerusalem from its Muslim defenders, the Hospital of St. John found itself transformed from a simple charitable institution into a crucial component of the new Crusader kingdom's survival strategy. The Crusader state's precarious military position and constant need for defense created opportunities for religious orders to expand their mission beyond traditional charitable work into military service that would protect Christian pilgrims and defend the Holy Land itself. Brother Gerard's decision to embrace military responsibilities alongside the hospital's traditional charitable work marked a calculated institutional adaptation disguised as natural religious evolution. The Hospitallers had observed how military success provided opportunities to expand their charitable activities while gaining political influence that could protect their religious mission. Unlike purely charitable institutions, this military adaptation incorporated elements designed to appeal to the martial values of European knightly culture while maintaining the spiritual legitimacy that defined religious orders. The fighters recruited for the early Hospitaller military activities came from volunteers attracted by the order's unique combination of religious devotion and military service. Crusader military culture had provided a steady supply of knights seeking spiritual advancement through warfare, and the Hospitallers offered an institutional framework that combined military service with guaranteed salvation and community support. Each new recruit represented a different background. Some were younger sons of noble families seeking advancement through religious service. Others were experienced warriors drawn to the order's military reputation, while still others were former pilgrims who had decided to remain in the Holy Land to defend other Christians. The military training itself followed established patterns of knightly education, but incorporated distinctly Hospitaller modifications. Each combat preparation began with the knights participating in religious ceremonies that emphasized their spiritual mission and dedication to protecting Christian pilgrims. The weapons training included standard medieval military equipment, enhanced with the specialized knowledge necessary for warfare in the unique conditions of the Eastern Mediterranean. Most significantly, the training emphasized not only individual combat skills, but also the coordinated group tactics that would allow relatively small numbers of highly trained knights to achieve decisive victories against larger enemy forces. The European nobility's reaction to this first military religious order exceeded all expectations. Knights who had initially considered the Hospitallers merely as charitable workers found themselves impressed by the order's effectiveness in combat and its ability to combine military excellence with genuine religious devotion. The order's success in defending Christian territories created popular support that transcended social boundaries, uniting secular nobles and religious leaders in their appreciation for displays of both martial skill and spiritual commitment. This positive response immediately demonstrated the political potential of military religious orders as institutions that could serve both temporal and spiritual needs simultaneously. Following the success of the Hospitaller military transformation, other religious communities began incorporating military elements into their own institutional structures. The practice spread rapidly among new religious foundations who recognized the opportunity to serve both God and the practical needs of Christian society through organized military service. Within 2 decades of the Hospitallers' military adoption, military religious orders had become expected elements of Christian defense strategy, with various communities competing to provide the most effective combination of spiritual devotion and military effectiveness. The evolution from charitable institution to military order accelerated during the early 12th century as ambitious leaders discovered the strategic advantages of controlling disciplined military forces dedicated to religious objectives. The Crusader state's constant need for reliable military support created intense demand for professional military forces, and military religious orders provided an effective means of maintaining permanent garrisons while ensuring that military service served spiritual as well as political purposes. Unlike traditional feudal military service, which relied on temporary obligations and personal loyalty, military religious orders offered permanent professional military capability combined with spiritual motivation. Raymond Dupuy exemplified this new approach to religious military leadership when he established the comprehensive rule that would govern Hospitaller military and charitable activities for centuries. Raymond imported the most effective military training methods from throughout Europe, including specialized combat techniques from France, Germany, and Italy that were adapted for the unique conditions of warfare in the Holy Land. The rule established standards for military service, religious devotion, and charitable work that created a new model for Christian military organization. Raymond's leadership demonstrated the compatibility of military excellence with religious perfection, establishing precedents for military religious orders throughout medieval Europe. The role of the Grand Master in Hospitaller military organization became increasingly important as military activities expanded in scale and complexity. The Grand Master bore complete responsibility for strategic planning, military training, and resource allocation while maintaining the order's religious character and charitable mission. Successful Grand Masters developed reputations for both military competence and spiritual authority, while those who failed to balance these responsibilities effectively faced criticism from both secular rulers who needed their military support and religious authorities who demanded adherence to spiritual standards. The financial resources required for maintaining effective military forces created both opportunities and challenges for the expanding military religious orders. Wealthy European donors could support spectacular military campaigns that demonstrated their religious commitment while advancing Christian political objectives. But the costs involved in maintaining permanent military forces, constructing fortifications, and supporting charitable activities could exhaust even substantial resources. A single major military campaign might cost the equivalent of several years' income for a moderately wealthy European province, forcing the order to develop sophisticated financial management systems and diverse revenue sources. The transformation of charitable religious life into military religious service required significant modifications to traditional monastic organization and spiritual practice, while maintaining the religious justification of serving God through service to others. Military brothers began scheduling their religious obligations around military training, campaign seasons, and the strategic requirements of defending Christian territories. The timing of religious observances became as important as their spiritual content, with religious leaders carefully calculating the optimal balance between spiritual development and military effectiveness. The military facilities constructed by the Hospitallers expanded beyond traditional monastery buildings to accommodate the complex requirements of professional military training and fortress warfare. Permanent stone fortifications were built throughout the Crusader states, including sophisticated castle complexes that featured advanced defensive architecture, comprehensive training facilities, and the residential infrastructure necessary for supporting large numbers of military religious brothers and their support personnel. The professionalization of military religious service emerged as a natural response to the growing sophistication of warfare in the Eastern Mediterranean and the increasing military pressure exerted by Muslim forces seeking to recapture territories lost during the First Crusade. The early system of relying on temporary volunteers and seasonal campaigning proved inadequate for maintaining effective defense of extended frontiers against professional Muslim armies. Religious communities began establishing formal military training programs where brothers received systematic instruction in weapons handling, siege warfare, and cavalry tactics under the supervision of experienced military commanders. The Master Sergeant system developed as the organizational framework for professional military religious service. These military entrepreneurs and religious leaders created hierarchical command structures that could coordinate complex military operations while maintaining the spiritual discipline necessary for religious community life. The most successful military orders operated multiple castles and maintained hundreds of military brothers, developing reputations for producing forces of exceptional skill and reliability. The training regimen within military religious communities combined traditional monastic discipline with intensive military preparation. New recruits underwent rigorous spiritual formation to build the religious commitment necessary for lifelong service, while also receiving comprehensive military training that covered individual combat skills, group tactics, and the specialized knowledge required for siege warfare and cavalry operations. The training included both military techniques and spiritual disciplines designed to prepare brothers for facing death in service to God and the Christian community. The development of standardized military religious roles reflected the professionalization of the institution and the need to create efficient military organizations. The Knight Brother fought with heavy cavalry equipment and received the most comprehensive military training, while Sergeant Brothers provided essential military support in specialized roles such as archery, siege engineering, and logistics management. Each type required different training and served different tactical functions, allowing military commanders to create balanced forces that could handle the full range of military challenges they might encounter. The economic structure supporting military religious orders became increasingly complex as the scale and frequency of military operations expanded. European donors invested heavily in military equipment, castle construction, and the acquisition of new territories, expecting to advance their spiritual welfare while supporting practical Christian political objectives. The most expensive military projects commanded premium support from wealthy patrons, while basic military maintenance could be funded through more modest donations and the agricultural revenues generated by the order's landed possessions. The legal status of military religious brothers reflected the complex institutional requirements of combining religious vows with military service obligations. Most brothers were free men who had voluntarily surrendered certain legal rights in exchange for community membership and spiritual advancement, while also accepting military service obligations that could result in death or injury in combat. However, some military religious communities also included brothers who served under different legal arrangements, creating complex hierarchies that combined elements of traditional monasticism with military professionalism. The relationship between military religious orders and secular society involved both cooperation and tension, as these institutions carved out unique roles that served both spiritual and temporal needs while maintaining independence from traditional feudal obligations. While secular rulers appreciated the military effectiveness and reliability of military religious orders, they sometimes resented the order's independence and their ability to pursue their own strategic objectives. This tension created ongoing negotiations about the proper relationship between religious military institutions and secular political authority. The medical care provided to military religious brothers represented one of the most advanced aspects of medieval military medicine. Military religious communities employed skilled physicians who specialized in treating combat injuries and maintaining the health and fighting effectiveness of active military forces. These doctors developed innovative surgical techniques for treating sword and arrow wounds, pioneered field medicine practices that could be used during military campaigns, and created rehabilitation programs that helped wounded brothers return to active service when possible. The dietary requirements for military religious brothers differed significantly from traditional monastic nutrition, emphasizing foods that would support the physical demands of military training and combat operations while maintaining spiritual disciplines appropriate for religious life. Military religious communities provided high-energy diets featuring meat, grains, and other foods necessary for maintaining fighting condition, while also observing religious fasting requirements and maintaining the communal dining practices that reinforced community solidarity and spiritual development. The psychological demands of military religious life involved preparing brothers to face death in combat, while maintaining the spiritual commitment and community solidarity necessary for effective religious life. Military religious communities employed various techniques to build mental toughness and spiritual resilience, including intensive religious instruction that emphasized the salvific value of military service, community prayer and liturgical practices that reinforced group identity and divine protection, and individual spiritual direction that helped brothers integrate their military and religious identities successfully. The sophisticated fortress system that emerged during the Hospitaller Golden Age represented far more than random defensive construction. It constituted a carefully orchestrated network of military engineering, where each castle's design was precisely determined by its strategic location, available resources, and tactical relationship to other fortifications in the broader defense system. The evolution from simple defensive outposts to comprehensive fortress complexes required the development of specialized military architecture, advanced siege defense techniques, and the systematic integration of military and logistical considerations that reached its pinnacle in the strategic positioning of castles whose defensive capabilities generated maximum strategic control while creating tactical vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit only at enormous cost. The most sophisticated and strategically important fortress complex in Hospitaller history was Crac de Chevalier, positioned to control the crucial gap between the Orontes River Valley and the Mediterranean coastal regions of northern Syria. The Hospitaller garrison entered this massive fortress equipped with comprehensive defensive systems, including concentric walls that created multiple defensive perimeters, a sophisticated water management system that could sustain siege conditions indefinitely, and advanced mechanical devices including counterweight trebuchets capable of delivering devastating defensive fire against approaching siege engines. This fortress's design prioritized strategic control and long-term sustainability over rapid tactical response. The Crac de Chevalier defensive system centered on maintaining strategic dominance while exploiting the fortress's superior position and defensive technology. The concentric walls created killing zones where attacking forces faced crossfire from multiple defensive positions, while the fortress's elevated position allowed defenders to observe enemy movements across vast distances and coordinate defensive responses accordingly. The sophisticated design could deliver withering defensive fire, while preventing enemy forces from effectively deploying their own siege equipment, and the fortress's internal organization allowed defenders to maintain effective resistance even when outer defensive perimeters had been breached. The tactical approach of fortress defenders required exceptional organizational skills and systematic defensive planning. These military communities trained extensively in coordinated defensive operations, siege logistics, and the specialized techniques necessary for maintaining effective resistance during extended siege warfare. The most skilled defenders could coordinate simultaneous defensive operations from multiple defensive positions, targeting specific components of enemy siege operations while maintaining overall defensive integrity and preserving resources for extended resistance. The Margat fortress, positioned to dominate the coastal approaches to northern Syria, presented a markedly different strategic profile despite similar levels of defensive sophistication. Margat's location on a dramatic promontory provided natural defensive advantages that were enhanced through comprehensive military engineering, while its proximity to the Mediterranean allowed for maritime resupply and communication with other Hospitaller positions. The fortress's design emphasized rapid response to naval threats and the ability to project military power along coastal routes that connected various Crusader territories. The defensive techniques employed at Margat exploited the fortress's unique topographical position through engineering solutions that maximized natural defensive advantages while compensating for potential vulnerabilities. The castle's placement on steep cliffs made direct assault extremely difficult, while its sophisticated harbour facilities allowed defenders to maintain contact with the broader Hospitaller network, even during siege conditions. Margat's defenders developed specialised techniques for coastal defence and naval combat that complemented traditional siege defence methods. The strategic philosophy underlying Margat's defensive system emphasised mobile defence and the ability to threaten enemy communications and supply lines rather than purely passive resistance. These defenders excelled at launching counterattacks against enemy siege operations and maintaining offensive capabilities that could disrupt enemy strategic planning. The fortress's position allowed for comprehensive observation of enemy naval movements and the coordination of defensive responses that involved both land and sea operations. The engineering innovations incorporated into major Hospitaller fortresses included sophisticated mechanical systems that enhanced defensive capabilities while reducing the manpower requirements for effective defense. Crac de Chevalier featured advanced counterweight systems for operating heavy siege equipment, hydraulic mechanisms for water distribution and waste management, and mechanical devices for moving heavy defensive materials to strategic positions quickly and efficiently during combat operations. The construction techniques employed in Hospitaller fortress building drew directly from the most advanced military engineering traditions available in the medieval Mediterranean world. Muslim siege warfare had provided extensive knowledge of defensive architecture and siege defense techniques, while Byzantine engineering traditions contributed sophisticated understanding of hydraulic systems, mechanical devices, and the integration of various defensive technologies into comprehensive fortress designs. European castle building experience added knowledge of administration, logistics, and the organizational systems necessary for maintaining large fortress garrisons over extended periods. The tactical innovations developed within Hospitaller fortress systems created comprehensive approaches to siege defense that integrated passive defensive measures with active offensive operations designed to neutralize enemy siege capabilities. Fortress commanders developed techniques for coordinating multiple simultaneous defensive operations, using mobile strike forces to attack enemy siege equipment while maintaining secure defensive positions, and exploiting enemy vulnerabilities created by the logistical challenges of maintaining large armies in hostile territory for extended periods. The heavily fortified positions established by the Hospitallers represented a different strategic philosophy, emphasizing comprehensive territorial control and the ability to project military power across large geographic areas rather than simply defending isolated positions. Major fortress complexes like Belvoir and Belmont were designed to anchor comprehensive defensive systems that could coordinate military responses across multiple threatened areas while providing secure bases for offensive operations against enemy territorial positions. The fortress construction techniques employed by Hospitaller military engineers emphasized systematic defensive planning and the integration of various specialized defensive technologies into unified defensive systems. These fortress builders excelled at designing comprehensive defensive perimeters that channeled enemy attacks into predetermined killing zones while maintaining secure interior areas that could sustain garrison populations during extended siege operations. The fortress design included sophisticated storage systems for food, water, weapons, and other essential supplies necessary for long-term independent operation. The tactical challenges facing fortress commanders centered on maintaining effective defense against increasingly sophisticated siege warfare techniques, while preserving the capacity for offensive operations that could relieve pressure on other hospitaller positions. These commanders developed sophisticated techniques for coordinating garrison activities, managing resources during siege conditions, and maintaining communication with other hospitaller installations and allied military forces operating in the broader strategic theatre. The specialized fortress categories represented the hospitaller system's capacity for strategic innovation beyond traditional defensive castle construction. Harbour fortifications brought naval defence capabilities into the fortress system, protecting crucial maritime supply routes and communication links while providing secure bases for offensive naval operations against enemy shipping and coastal installations. These installations typically combined land-based defensive systems with specialized naval facilities that could support various types of military vessels. The equipment and resource requirements for maintaining effective fortress systems exceeded those of other military installations due to the complexity of siege defense and the need to sustain large garrison populations under combat conditions. Fortress commanders needed comprehensive supply management systems combined with specialized military equipment, as defending major fortifications against determined siege efforts demanded extensive preparation and resource accumulation that could sustain operations for months or years without external resupply. The relationship between fortress garrisons and local civilian populations involved complex arrangements that provided mutual security benefits while creating strategic vulnerabilities that enemy forces could potentially exploit. Fortress positions often served as regional administrative centers that provided security for surrounding agricultural areas while drawing resources and recruits from local populations. The most effective fortress systems developed cooperative relationships with local communities that provided intelligence about enemy movements while contributing to fortress defense during major military operations. The strategic coordination between different hospitaller fortress positions required sophisticated communication systems and standardized defensive procedures that allowed individual commanders to contribute effectively to broader strategic objectives while maintaining local defensive effectiveness. Military engineers developed signal systems, messenger routes, and coordination protocols that enabled rapid communication between fortress positions and facilitated mutual support during major enemy military campaigns. The medical and logistical infrastructure within major fortress complexes represented some of the most advanced military support systems available in the medieval world. Fortress hospitals provided comprehensive medical care for garrison troops and civilian populations, while maintaining the specialized medical knowledge necessary for treating siege-related injuries and diseases. The logistical systems included sophisticated storage and distribution networks that could sustain large populations during emergency conditions, while maintaining normal operational effectiveness. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 to Saladin's forces marked a crucial turning point that would force the Hospitallers to adapt their strategic approach while maintaining their essential military and charitable functions under dramatically altered political and military conditions. The catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Hattin had decimated the military resources of the Crusader states, while demonstrating the vulnerability of Christian military forces to coordinated Muslim military campaigns that could exploit strategic weaknesses in Crusader defensive systems. The strategic adaptation required by the loss of Jerusalem involved comprehensive reorganization of hospitaller priorities and military commitments, while preserving the institutional identity and religious mission that defined the Order's essential character. The Order's leadership recognized that maintaining effective military capability required concentrating resources in the most defensible positions, while accepting the loss of less strategically valuable territories that could not be defended effectively with available military resources. The transformation of the Knights Hospitaller from land-based fortress defenders to masters of Mediterranean naval warfare began with their strategic withdrawal from the collapsing Crusader states and their subsequent conquest of the island of Rhodes. In this maritime transformation represented one of the most remarkable institutional adaptations in medieval history, As an order originally dedicated to caring for pilgrims in Jerusalem, reinvented itself as Europe's premier naval military force, while maintaining its fundamental religious character and charitable mission. The conquest of Rhodes itself demonstrated the Order's strategic vision and military adaptability as Hospitaller forces overcame both the island's existing defences and the complex logistical challenges of amphibious warfare in the early 14th century. Grandmaster Falcon of Vivarais led a carefully planned campaign that combined naval superiority with systematic siege warfare, ultimately forcing the surrender of the island's Byzantine garrison after a 2-year military campaign that established Hospitaller sovereignty over one of the most strategically important positions in the eastern Mediterranean. The fortification of Rhodes represented perhaps the most comprehensive military engineering project undertaken by any medieval military order, as the Hospitallers transformed an existing Byzantine fortress city into the most advanced naval fortress of its era. The construction project required mobilizing resources from throughout Europe while developing new architectural techniques that addressed the unique requirements of defending an island position against both naval assault and prolonged siege warfare. The resulting fortifications featured massive artillery-resistant walls, sophisticated harbour defences, and comprehensive logistical infrastructure that could sustain a large garrison and civilian population indefinitely. The development of the Hospitaller naval fleet marked a fundamental transformation in the Order's military capabilities and strategic focus. The acquisition and construction of war galleys, armed merchant vessels, and specialized combat ships required massive financial investment and the development of entirely new areas of military expertise, including naval architecture, maritime logistics, and the complex administrative systems necessary for maintaining an effective naval force. The Hospitaller fleet eventually comprised over 100 vessels of various types, making it one of the largest naval forces in the Mediterranean world. The galley warfare that became the foundation of Hospitaller naval operations combined traditional Mediterranean naval combat techniques with innovative tactical approaches that exploited the Order's unique advantages as a disciplined military religious community. Hospitaller galleys typically featured enhanced armour protection, standardized armament, and carefully trained crews whose religious motivation and military discipline gave them significant advantages over purely secular naval forces or irregularly organized pirate fleets that dominated much of the Mediterranean. The tactical approach employed by Hospitaller naval forces emphasized aggressive offensive operations designed to establish maritime supremacy through systematic destruction of enemy naval capabilities and merchant shipping. The Order's strategic position at Rhodes provided an ideal base for conducting extended naval campaigns throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while their religious motivation and financial resources allowed them to maintain larger and more effective naval forces than most of their competitors. The corsair warfare conducted by the Hospitallers against Ottoman shipping represented a systematic campaign of economic warfare designed to weaken the growing Ottoman Empire while generating the financial resources necessary for maintaining the Order's expensive naval operations. These corsair activities targeted Ottoman merchant vessels, disrupted enemy supply lines, and captured enemy personnel who could be ransomed or exchanged for Christian prisoners held in Muslim territories. The financial returns from successful corsair operations provided substantial revenues that supported both military activities and charitable work. The harbour facilities constructed at Rhodes featured some of the most advanced naval architecture of the period, including fortified docks that could accommodate the largest vessels while providing protection against enemy naval attack. The harbour defences included underwater barriers, artillery emplacements positioned to control all approaches to the port, and boom defences that could be deployed to prevent enemy vessels from entering the harbour during combat operations. These facilities allowed the Hospitallers to maintain and repair their naval forces while providing secure bases for offensive operations. The organisational structure that governed Hospitaller naval operations reflected the order's adaptation of traditional monastic administration to the complex requirements of naval warfare and maritime commerce. The admiral of the order held supreme command over all naval forces, while reporting directly to the Grand Master, creating a unified command structure that could coordinate complex naval campaigns while maintaining the religious discipline and charitable commitments that defined the order's identity. The Lang system that organized the order's membership, according to national and linguistic groups, provided the administrative framework for recruiting and training naval personnel from throughout Christian Europe. Each Lang contributed specific expertise and resources to the order's naval operations. The French provided heavy cavalry expertise that adapted effectively to naval boarding operations. The Spanish contributed extensive maritime experience. The Italians offered advanced naval architecture and siege engineering knowledge, while the English, Germans, and other nationalities added their own specialized capabilities to the order's comprehensive naval establishment. The recruitment of naval personnel required developing entirely new categories of membership within the order, as traditional knight brothers needed to be supplemented with mariners, naval architects, artillery specialists, and the numerous support personnel necessary for effective naval operations. The order created new ranks and positions that accommodated these specialized roles while maintaining the religious character that distinguished Hospitaller military service from purely secular naval employment. The training programs developed for Hospitaller naval forces combined traditional military instruction with specialized maritime education that covered navigation, seamanship, naval tactics, and the maintenance of complex naval equipment. New recruits underwent comprehensive training that included both religious formation and professional maritime education, creating naval personnel whose technical competence was enhanced by religious motivation and community loyalty that provided significant advantages in the dangerous and demanding environment of Mediterranean naval warfare. The financial systems that supported Hospitaller naval operations required sophisticated international banking arrangements and commercial relationships that connected the Order's Rhodes headquarters with financial centres throughout Europe. The costs associated with constructing, maintaining, and operating large naval forces far exceeded traditional military expenses, forcing the Order to develop new revenue sources, including maritime commerce, corsair operations, and systematic taxation of their European properties. The diplomatic relationships that the Hospitallers maintained with various European powers and Mediterranean political entities reflected the complex political environment in which their naval operations occurred. The Order needed to balance their military activities against Ottoman targets with the diplomatic requirements of maintaining good relationships with European kingdoms whose support was essential for their survival, while also avoiding conflicts with neutral Mediterranean powers whose territories provided crucial supply bases and diplomatic protection. The technological innovations developed by Hospitaller naval architects and military engineers revolutionized Mediterranean warfare through the integration of artillery into naval combat and the development of specialized vessel designs that maximized combat effectiveness while maintaining the operational flexibility necessary for extended naval campaigns. The Order's shipyards at Rhodes became centres of naval innovation, where traditional galley designs were enhanced with improved armour protection, standardised artillery installations, and sophisticated logistic systems that allowed individual vessels to operate independently for extended periods. The intelligence networks established by the Hospitallers throughout the Mediterranean provided crucial strategic information about Ottoman military preparations, commercial activities, and political developments that affected the broader balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. These intelligence operations involved extensive networks of informants, commercial relationships that provided cover for intelligence gathering, and diplomatic contacts that supplied political information essential for strategic planning. The economic impact of Hospitaller naval operations extended throughout the Mediterranean world as their corsair activities disrupted Ottoman trade while generating substantial revenues for the order's military and charitable activities. The capture and ransom of Ottoman officials, merchants, and military personnel provided significant financial resources, while the seizure of enemy merchant vessels and their cargoes created lucrative prize revenues that helped fund the order's expensive naval establishment. The fortification improvements continuously implemented at Rhodes reflected the order's adaptation to changing military technology, particularly the increasing effectiveness of artillery in siege warfare. The massive construction projects undertaken during the 15th century created artillery-resistant fortifications that incorporated the latest developments in military architecture, while maintaining the comprehensive defensive systems necessary for protecting the island's population and strategic facilities against prolonged siege operations. The religious life maintained by the Hospitallers during their Rhodes period demonstrated their success in preserving their fundamental spiritual identity despite the demands of extensive military operations and the administrative complexity of governing an independent state. The Order's churches, hospitals, and charitable institutions continued operating throughout their naval transformation, providing medical care for both military personnel and civilian populations, while maintaining the religious observances and community life that distinguished the Hospitallers from purely secular military organizations. The Great Siege of Rhodes in 1520 represented the culmination of Ottoman efforts to eliminate the Hospitaller naval threat and demonstrated both the effectiveness of the Order's defensive preparations and the overwhelming military superiority that the Ottoman Empire could deploy when it committed sufficient resources to a strategic objective. Suleiman the Magnificent assembled one of the largest siege armies in Ottoman history, including over 100,000 troops, extensive artillery trains, and a naval fleet that established complete blockade of the island, while supporting systematic siege operations that continued for 6 months. The siege operations conducted by Ottoman forces revealed the sophistication of 16th century siege warfare and the challenge facing defenders of fortified positions against enemies who possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and unlimited resources. The Ottoman siege techniques included systematic artillery bombardment designed to breach the fortifications, extensive tunnel networks intended to undermine defensive walls, and comprehensive blockade operations that prevented external assistance from reaching the defenders. The Hospitaller defense during the Great Siege demonstrated exceptional military skill and religious determination as a garrison of fewer than 7,000 defenders successfully resisted the attack of a vastly superior enemy force for over 6 months. Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle coordinated a comprehensive defensive campaign that exploited every advantage provided by the island's fortifications while maintaining effective counter-operations that inflicted substantial casualties on the attacking forces. The negotiated surrender that ended the Great Siege reflected the mutual exhaustion of both sides, and Suleiman's recognition that continued siege operations might prove more costly than the strategic benefits gained by capturing Rhodes. The terms negotiated by Grand Master Villiers de l'Isle allowed the Hospitallers to depart with honour, while preserving their military equipment, religious artefacts, and institutional integrity, creating the possibility for the Order's eventual establishment in a new location where they could continue their military and charitable mission. The evacuation of Rhodes marked the end of the Order's first independent state, while beginning a period of institutional uncertainty that would test the Hospitallers' ability to maintain their identity and mission without a permanent territorial base. The withdrawal from Rhodes involved complex logistical operations that transferred the entire Hospitaller community, including military forces, civilian populations, religious institutions, and material resources, to temporary refuges throughout Europe, while the Order's leadership sought new territorial arrangements that would allow them to re-establish their independent military and charitable operations. The transformation of the Knights Hospitaller from homeless exiles to masters of the most advanced fortress state in Europe began with Emperor Charles V's shrewd political calculation that the Order's military expertise and financial resources could be deployed to defend Christianity's most vulnerable frontier against Ottoman expansion. In 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor granted the Hospitallers sovereignty over the Maltese archipelago, Gozo, and the North African fortress of Tripoli, creating a new territorial base that would become the foundation for the Order's greatest military achievements and their most sophisticated expression of fortress state governance. The initial assessment of Malta revealed both the strategic opportunities and the formidable challenges that would define the Hospitallers' transformation of this Mediterranean outpost into Europe's most formidable naval fortress. The island's position astride the central Mediterranean provided ideal opportunities for controlling maritime traffic between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire, while its excellent natural harbours offered secure bases for naval operations throughout the region. However, the island's limited agricultural resources, small population, and minimal existing fortifications would require massive investment and comprehensive development to create an effective military base. The systematic fortification of Malta represented the most ambitious military engineering project undertaken by any military religious order. As the Hospitallers applied 3 centuries of fortress warfare experience to creating defensive systems that could withstand the most advanced siege techniques available to 16th century military forces. The fortification program required importing skilled military engineers from throughout Europe while developing innovative architectural solutions that integrated traditional fortress design with the latest developments in artillery-resistant construction and comprehensive logistical planning. The construction of Fort St. Elmo at the tip of the Cerberus Peninsula demonstrated the Hospitallers' understanding of the strategic requirements for controlling Malta's magnificent harbour complex, while providing early warning and initial resistance against naval attacks. This fortress, though relatively small compared to the Order's later constructions, incorporated the most advanced military architecture available in the mid-16th century, including angled bastions designed to eliminate dead zones where attacking forces could find protection from defensive fire. The development of Burgul Vittoriosa as the Order's initial headquarters and primary fortress complex reflected their adaptation of existing medieval fortifications to meet the requirements of early modern artillery warfare. The comprehensive reconstruction of this peninsular fortress included massive new walls designed to resist cannon fire, sophisticated artillery emplacements positioned to control all approaches to the harbour, and extensive underground facilities that could sustain a large garrison during prolonged siege operations. The Grand Master's Palace, constructed in Burgu, represented both the administrative centre of the Hospitaller state and a symbol of the Order's successful transition from displaced refugees to sovereign rulers of a strategic Mediterranean territory. The palace complex combined residential facilities for the Grand Master and senior officials with the administrative offices, archives and ceremonial spaces necessary for governing an independent state, while maintaining the religious character that distinguished Hospitaller rule from purely secular political authority. The recruitment and training of the garrison forces that would defend Malta required adapting the Order's traditional military organisation to the specific requirements of fortress defence against the massive siege armies that the Ottoman Empire could deploy. The permanent garrison included knight brothers from all 8 langas of the Order, supported by professional soldiers recruited from throughout Europe and local Maltese militia forces, whose knowledge of local terrain and conditions proved invaluable during military operations. The logistical preparations undertaken by the Hospitallers in anticipation of Ottoman attack demonstrated sophisticated understanding of siege warfare requirements and the systematic planning necessary to sustain effective resistance against overwhelming enemy forces. The Order accumulated massive stockpiles of food, water, gunpowder, artillery ammunition, and medical supplies while developing comprehensive plans for resource distribution and population management during siege conditions. The intelligence networks established throughout the Mediterranean provided the Hospitallers with detailed information about Ottoman military preparations and strategic planning, allowing them to anticipate the timing and scale of the attack that would determine Malta's fate and their own survival as an independent military order. These intelligence operations involved extensive networks of informants, diplomatic contacts, and commercial relationships that supplied crucial strategic information while maintaining operational security about Hospitaller defensive preparations. The Great Siege of Malta in 1565 represented one of the most significant military confrontations of the 16th century, as the Ottoman Empire deployed its most formidable military resources in a systematic campaign designed to eliminate the Hospitaller threat to Ottoman maritime supremacy, while extending Turkish control throughout the central Mediterranean. The Ottoman siege force commanded by Mustafa Pasha included over 40,000 troops, extensive artillery trains, and a naval fleet that established complete blockade of the Maltese archipelago, while supporting comprehensive siege operations that continued for over 3 months. The siege strategy employed by Ottoman forces reflected the most advanced military thinking of the period, combining systematic artillery bombardment with coordinated assault operations designed to overwhelm specific defensive positions while maintaining pressure on the entire Hospitaller defensive system. The Ottoman plan involved simultaneous attacks on Fort St. Elmo, Birgu, and Senglea, forcing the defenders to divide their limited resources while preventing effective mutual support between different defensive positions. Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette emerged as one of history's greatest military leaders through his masterful coordination of the Maltese defence against overwhelming odds. Valette's strategic approach combined careful resource management with aggressive tactical operations that exploited every advantage provided by the Hospitaller defensive preparations while maintaining the morale and fighting effectiveness of a garrison that faced almost certain death if their resistance failed. The defence of Fort St. Elmo became the siege's defining episode, as a garrison of fewer than 150 knights and soldiers resisted Ottoman assault for over a month, while inflicting casualties that ultimately undermined the entire Ottoman campaign. The fortress's position controlling access to the Grand Harbour made its capture essential for Ottoman strategic objectives, but the prolonged resistance required by its defenders cost the attackers thousands of casualties while consuming resources and time that proved crucial to the siege's ultimate failure. The tactical innovations developed by Hospitaller defenders during the siege included sophisticated coordination between different fortress positions, innovative use of artillery in defensive roles, and the systematic exploitation of Ottoman tactical vulnerabilities that were revealed through careful observation of enemy assault techniques. The defenders developed new methods for repairing battle damage quickly, coordinating counterattacks against enemy siege positions, and maintaining effective resistance despite severe shortages of personnel and supplies. The psychological warfare that accompanied the military operations demonstrated the religious and cultural dimensions of the conflict, as both sides recognized that the siege's outcome would determine the future balance of power between Christian and Muslim civilizations in the Mediterranean world. The Hospitallers' resistance became a symbol of Christian determination to resist Islamic expansion, while Ottoman forces viewed their campaign as a holy war that would advance Muslim territorial control while eliminating a persistent threat to Ottoman maritime interests. The arrival of a small Sicilian relief force under Don Garcia de Toledo provided the final element that ensured Ottoman defeat, as the appearance of Christian reinforcements convinced the already exhausted Turkish forces that continued siege operations had become unsustainable. The relief force, though numbering fewer than 10,000 men, represented fresh troops whose arrival coincided with the Ottoman army's exhaustion and demoralization after months of costly and unsuccessful assault operations. The Ottoman withdrawal marked not only the end of the immediate military threat to Malta, but also a crucial turning point in the broader struggle between Christian and Muslim powers for control of the Mediterranean world. The successful defense of Malta demonstrated that Ottoman military power was not invincible, while providing European Christianity with a desperately needed victory that restored confidence in the possibility of effective resistance against Turkish expansion. The aftermath of the Great Siege transformed the Hospitallers from a relatively minor military order into heroes of Christian Europe whose victory had preserved European civilization against its most serious external threat. The siege's successful conclusion generated enormous prestige for the order, while providing the political support and financial resources necessary for undertaking the massive construction projects that would create Europe's most advanced fortress city. The planning and construction of Valletta represented the culmination of Renaissance military architecture and urban planning, as the Hospitallers created a purpose-built fortress city that incorporated the most advanced defensive concepts available, while providing comprehensive facilities for military, administrative, commercial, and residential activities. The city's design reflected lessons learned during the Great Siege, while anticipating future developments in siege warfare and artillery technology. Francesco Laparelli, the military engineer responsible for Valletta's design, created a comprehensive urban plan that integrated defensive requirements with the practical needs of a functioning city, while maintaining the aesthetic standards expected of a Renaissance capital. The city's grid pattern, wide streets, and systematically planned public spaces reflected both military necessities and Renaissance urban planning ideals, creating a unique synthesis of defensive architecture and civic design. The construction of Valletta required mobilizing resources from throughout Europe, as the Order's victory at Malta had generated enormous goodwill and financial support from grateful Christian rulers who recognized the strategic importance of maintaining effective defenses against renewed Ottoman attack. The construction program employed thousands of skilled craftsmen while developing new techniques for fortress construction that would influence military architecture throughout Europe. The fortifications surrounding Valletta incorporated the most advanced concepts in artillery-resistant design, including massive bastions positioned to eliminate dead zones in defensive fire coverage, sophisticated artillery emplacements that could concentrate devastating fire on attacking forces, and comprehensive underground facilities that could sustain the city's population during extended siege operations. The defensive system represented the practical application of 3 centuries of Hospitaller fortress warfare experience, enhanced by the latest developments in military engineering. The harbour facilities, constructed to support Valletta's role as the Mediterranean's premier naval fortress, included extensive docking facilities that could accommodate the largest warships while providing secure anchorage and comprehensive repair facilities for maintaining large naval forces. The harbour defences included underwater barriers, artillery positions controlling all approaches to the port, and sophisticated boom defences that could prevent enemy naval forces from entering the harbour during combat operations. The golden age of Hospitaller naval power that followed their successful defence of Malta represented the Order's transformation into Europe's most effective naval force against Ottoman maritime expansion and Barbary corsair activities throughout the Mediterranean world. The prestige gained from their heroic resistance during the Great Siege provided the Hospitallers with unprecedented political support and financial resources that enabled them to construct and maintain naval forces capable of challenging Ottoman naval supremacy while conducting systematic campaigns against Muslim corsair bases throughout North Africa. The development of the Hospitaller fleet during the late 16th century reflected both the enormous financial resources available to the Order following their Malta victory and their systematic approach to naval warfare that combined traditional Mediterranean galley tactics with innovative applications of artillery and systematic coordination between multiple vessel types. The Order's naval forces eventually included over 50 major warships supported by numerous smaller vessels, creating one of the largest and most effective naval establishments in the contemporary Mediterranean world. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 marked the pinnacle of Hospitaller naval achievement, as the Order's galleys played a crucial role in the Holy League's decisive victory over the Ottoman fleet that ended Turkish naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. The Hospitaller squadron, commanded by Pietro Giustiniani, demonstrated exceptional tactical skill and fighting effectiveness while contributing to the broader Christian naval victory that eliminated the Ottoman threat to European maritime interests and established Christian naval dominance throughout the Mediterranean region. The tactical innovations employed by Hospitaller naval forces at Lepanto included sophisticated coordination between different vessel types, innovative use of artillery in naval combat, and systematic exploitation of Ottoman tactical vulnerabilities that were revealed through careful study of Turkish naval methods. The Hospitaller galleys featured enhanced armour protection, standardised artillery installations, and carefully trained crews whose religious motivation and military discipline provided significant advantages over their Ottoman opponents. The systematic campaigns conducted by Hospitaller naval forces against Barbary Corsair bases throughout North Africa represented comprehensive strategic operations designed to eliminate the Corsair threat to Christian shipping while liberating Christian slaves held in Muslim territories. These campaigns required extensive logistical planning, sophisticated intelligence gathering, and coordinated operations involving both naval forces and specialized landing parties trained for amphibious assault operations against fortified coastal positions. The liberation of Christian slaves became one of the Order's most important humanitarian activities during their naval golden age, as Hospitaller expeditions successfully freed thousands of Europeans who had been captured by Muslim corsairs and sold into slavery throughout the Ottoman Empire and North African territories. These liberation operations involved complex negotiations, ransom payments, and occasional military operations that demonstrated the Order's continued commitment to their original charitable mission despite their evolution into a primarily military organization. The fortification improvements continuously implemented at Valletta and throughout the Maltese archipelago reflected the Order's adaptation to changing military technology while maintaining their defensive superiority against potential Ottoman renewal of siege operations. The construction projects undertaken during the late 16th and early 17th centuries created the most advanced fortress system in Europe, incorporating the latest developments in artillery-resistant architecture while providing comprehensive facilities for supporting large garrison forces and civilian populations. The economic prosperity generated by successful naval operations provided the financial foundation for extensive cultural and architectural development throughout Malta as the Order invested their military profits in creating one of Europe's most magnificent Renaissance cities. The construction of palaces, churches, hospitals, and public buildings transformed Valletta into a showcase of European civilization, while demonstrating the compatibility of military effectiveness with cultural achievement and religious devotion. The diplomatic influence exercised by the Hospitallers throughout Europe reflected their strategic importance as Christianity's primary naval defense against Ottoman and Corsair threats, while their independent sovereignty allowed them to serve as neutral intermediaries in European political conflicts. The Order's diplomatic activities included negotiating prisoner exchanges, mediating commercial disputes, and providing intelligence services that enhanced European security while advancing the Order's own strategic interests. The internal governance systems developed by the Hospitallers during their Malta period represented sophisticated adaptations of traditional monastic administration to the requirements of governing an independent state with extensive military commitments and complex international relationships. The Grand Master's authority was balanced by the Council of the Order, which included representatives from all 8 Langols and provided systematic oversight of administrative, military, and financial activities. The decline of Hospitaller military effectiveness during the 17th and 18th centuries resulted from multiple factors, including changes in naval warfare technology that reduced the importance of galley-based combat, the Order's increasing involvement in European political conflicts that diverted resources from their primary anti-Ottoman mission, and internal corruption that undermined the religious discipline and military effectiveness that had characterized their earlier achievements. The transformation of warfare during the early modern period created strategic challenges that the Hospitallers struggled to address effectively as their traditional galley-based naval tactics became obsolete, while their fortress-focused defensive strategies proved inadequate against the evolving requirements of European power politics. The development of line-of-battle sailing ship tactics, improved artillery technology, and professional national armies reduced the relative importance of military religious orders, while creating military environments that favoured larger, more systematically organised military establishments. The internal corruption that increasingly characterised Hospitaller administration during the 18th century reflected the broader decline of military religious orders as European society became more secular, and the original religious motivations that had sustained these institutions gradually weakened. The order's increasing wealth and political influence attracted members who were motivated by social advancement and personal enrichment rather than religious devotion and military service, creating internal tensions that undermined institutional effectiveness. The loss of religious discipline that accompanied the order's political and social evolution created fundamental contradictions between their traditional monastic vows and the lifestyle demanded by their role as sovereign rulers of a wealthy Mediterranean state. Many Hospitaller knights abandoned their religious obligations while maintaining their positions within the order purely for social and economic advantages, creating scandal and undermining the moral authority that had sustained popular support for their military activities. The French Revolution's impact on the Hospitallers proved catastrophic as revolutionary forces confiscated the order's extensive French properties, while ideological opposition to religious institutions eliminated much of the popular support that had sustained the order's activities throughout Europe. The loss of French revenues, which had provided approximately half of the order's total income, created financial crisis that undermined their ability to maintain effective military forces while supporting their charitable activities and administrative expenses. The rise of French revolutionary nationalism and anti-religious sentiment created ideological opposition to military religious orders as symbols of the old regime that revolutionaries sought to eliminate. The Hospitallers' status as international Catholic military organisation made them particular targets for revolutionary hostility, while their wealth and independence provided additional motivation for confiscatory policies designed to fund revolutionary activities and eliminate institutional opposition to radical political change. Napoleon's conquest of Malta in 1798 marked the end of the Hospitaller sovereign state and demonstrated the order's inability to adapt effectively to the military and political changes that had transformed European warfare during the late 18th century. The brief and ineffective resistance offered by Hospitaller forces revealed how completely their military capabilities had deteriorated from the heights achieved during their 16th century Golden Age, while their surrender without serious fighting completed the destruction of their military reputation and political independence. The strategic miscalculations that led to the order's collapse included their failure to maintain adequate defensive preparations, their dependence on European political support that proved unreliable during crisis, and their inability to adapt traditional military methods to counter the professional armies and modern artillery that characterized Napoleonic warfare. The Hospitallers' defeat represented not merely the loss of territory, but the complete failure of an institutional model that had once provided effective military service while maintaining religious identity and charitable mission. The trauma of 1798 can be precisely traced. Napoleon's seizure of Malta stripped the order of its revenue base, its naval arsenal, and the symbolic capital accumulated since Rhodes. The capitulation's legal irregularities, accepted by a divided leadership under duress, haunted subsequent diplomacy. In the scramble that followed, multiple actors tried to convert the order's wreckage into advantage. The Tsar of Russia, Paul I, imagined himself Grand Master, and for a moment a northern protectorate of St. John flickered into existence at St. Petersburg. That episode, unstable and contested, nonetheless proved conceptually important. It showed that the order's charisma, its name, ritual, and legal personality could be hosted extraterritorially and still mobilize men, funds, and hospitals. It also revealed the risks of political capture when a religious magistracy tethered itself too tightly to a single crown. The destruction of the Hospitaller fortress state in 1798 did not end the Order's story, it detonated it into fragments, jurisdictions, memories, legal claims, and living practices that had to be reassembled without the bedrock of territory. What emerged over the next 2 centuries was not the restoration of a medieval principality, but something far more improbable, a sovereign religious order that learned to project power without walls, to govern without a country, and to turn the logistics of care, ambulances, field hospitals, refugee corridors, into its new strategy of warfighting by other means. The long 19th century obliged the Knights of St. John to prove that their continuity did not depend on cannon, bastions and fleets, but on rule, right and service forms that could survive exile and, in time, redefine it. Across Europe, the suppression or seizure of Hospitaller property proceeded unevenly. In Catholic monarchies, the order's houses were often folded into crown domains or episcopal patrimonies. In Protestant lands, the Johanniter and related tongues evolved along national lines, some maintaining chivalric and charitable inheritance without obeying the Roman obedience of the Grand Master. What might look like disintegration at first glance was, in practice, a diversification of governance models. The medieval Langals, once a strength, had become double-edged. Their national infrastructures preserved cadres and endowments, but they also gave governments levers to claim or tame them. The Roman refoundation during the 1830s supplied the order with a stable axis at last. With papal support and Italian acquiescence, the magistral court installed itself not upon an island, but within a layered urban sovereignty, the magistral palace on Via Condotti, and the villa on the Aventine, later recognised with a kind of exterritorial status that allowed the order to receive ambassadors, issue diplomatic notes, and maintain the symbols of statehood on a postage stamp footprint. The reseated magistracy did 3 things that defined the modern order. First, it codified constitutional life for a world without galleys, rearticulating the offices of Grand Master, Grand Commander, Grand Chancellor, and Grand Hospitaller, so that spiritual discipline, external relations, and works of mercy were balanced within a compact court. Second, it treated diplomatic recognition as a new form of strategic depth, carefully sewing relations with Catholic monarchies, then republics, then non-Catholic states on the pragmatic argument that humanitarian corridors needed flags, seals and immunities. Third, it made the hospital, not the fortress, its primary theatre, constructing an identity in which hospitality was no longer the prelude to arms, but the enduring strategy itself. The great European wars of the late 19th and early 20th centuries hardened these experiments. On the eve of the First World War, the Order's network of associations had already learned to coordinate with ministries of war and health. Once fighting began, those relationships allowed hospital ambulances and hospital trains to operate at scale. The moral geometry of neutrality, always delicate for a Catholic order with medieval martial memories, was resolved in practice by a simple priority: the wounded first, regardless of uniform. That ethic, worked out in thousands of bedside encounters, did more to secure the order's legitimacy than any diplomatic circular. It also renewed the old synthesis: medicine with liturgy, without requiring a confessional gate at the ward's door. Chaplains served, surgeons led, and the patient's sovereignty, not the order's, determined the sacraments offered or declined. The 19th century therefore became a laboratory of modalities rather than a mere coda. Where once the order measured its reach by bastions, it now measured capability in beds, trained personnel, and the speed at which aid could move from sacristy to street. Volunteer corps affiliated with national associations, especially in France, Italy, Germany and Spain, professionalized their operations. Uniforms and decorations still mattered. Symbols knit volunteers into tradition and attracted patrons, but the real innovations were procedural: triage protocols, sanitary discipline, procurement chains for linens and ether, and standardized field kits that any knight or dame could deploy under a commander's plan. The Second World War tested administrative resilience under aerial bombardment and occupation. Archival memoranda from the period show an organization that learned to operate in fragments, preserving continuity through redundancy. If a pharmacy was seized, the recipes and requisition forms survived in triplicate. If a clinic was bombed, its roster and case notes were already shared across town. The discipline of a rule-bound religious community, daily offices, fixed reporting rhythms, and obedience to command became a secular advantage. Where ad hoc charities burned out, the order could rotate teams, preserve standards, and hand off without loss of continuity. In the post-war years, the network turned outward, translating wartime mobility into peacetime disaster response across earthquakes, floods, and epidemics. The Grand Hospitale's brief expanded, training, vaccination campaigns, and mother and child clinics joined the repertory beside surgical tents and ambulance brigades. The second half of the 20th century forced an even bolder adaptation. The order learned to operate as a sovereign subject of international law, without claiming the predicates of a nation-state. This was an elegant compromise with modernity. The magistral palaces and their extraterritorial privileges anchored a recognizable seat, bilateral relations supplied legal corridors for aid, multilateral forums offered platforms for advocacy. Hierarchy was not flattened, but clarified. Professed knights, men under vows, sustained the spiritual core that justified the enterprise, while the second and third classes, knights, dames, chaplains, and volunteers under promises rather than vows, supplied the managerial and professional mass. The Sovereign Council, no longer concerned with garrison rotations, spent its time on budgets, association statutes, hospital governance, and the delicate choreography of remaining fully Catholic while working in religiously diverse environments. In this period, one sees a doubled inheritance. On the Catholic side, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, SMOM, operated from Rome. Its 8 centuries of tradition, alive in liturgy, insignia, and the canonical relationship with the Holy See. Alongside, in Protestant and Anglican spheres, cognate orders, most famously the Venerable Order of St. John and the German Johanniter Orden, developed parallel humanitarian empires. They did not obey the Roman Grand Master, but they cultivated a chivalric culture that ran ambulances, trained first responders, and built hospitals, most visibly through St. John ambulance organisations, active from London to Auckland. These branches occasionally cooperated in the field, especially after natural disasters, and at times explored ecumenical rapprochements. Beneath disputes over heraldry or precedents lay an undeniable convergence. St. John's charism of practical mercy had become a global grammar that could be conjugated in different ecclesial voices. The geographies of service multiplied accordingly. In the Middle East, clinics stabilized displaced families, treated chronic disease interrupted by conflict, and protected maternity in the midst of ruin. Across Africa, the Order's associations paired with dioceses and local NGOs to strengthen rural health systems, cold chains for vaccines, training for midwives, and referral systems so that a seizure in a village at dusk could result in a hospital bed before dawn. In Europe, the old heartland, the mission matured into social medicine, palliative care units, where the poor die with dignity, soup kitchens linked to medical screening, and mobile clinics that bring dermatology, dentistry, and psychiatry to the undocumented. Disaster response remained a signature capability, a hurricane in the Caribbean, a quake on the Anatolian Fault, flooding on the Danube, and here the Order's peculiarity became its comparative advantage. Its religious identity unlocked parish halls and diocesan warehouses within hours. Its diplomatic status unlocked tarmacs and customs within days. If the 16th century made Valletta a fortress of stone, the late 20th and early 21st centuries turned the Order into a fortress of corridors, legal, diplomatic, and logistical. Corridors through which vaccines move past customs, corridors negotiated with warring factions so an ambulance can cross a checkpoint, corridors of patient records standardized enough to hand off across borders and languages. This is not poetry, it is the hard power of care. The engineers of such corridors work with ministries of health and border guards, They read tariffs and indemnities as once their predecessors read soundings and tide tables. In quiet offices, they do what their forebears did in magazines and arsenals: accumulate, inventory, and dispatch. The order's legal and constitutional life did not stand still. Charter revisions in the late 20th and early 21st centuries wrestled with a real problem: how to reconcile a vowed celibate first class of professed religious with a global humanitarian machine that required seasoned lay professionals to run hospitals, negotiate with governments, and command multi-million euro budgets. The solution was not to secularize the order, but to formalize collaboration. The Grand Commander stewarded spiritual discipline, the Grand Chancellor ran diplomacy and internal administration, the Grand Hospitaller directed relief and development, and the receiver of the common treasure kept the ledgers in order. Where medieval chapters debated galley complements and gunpowder stocks, modern councils approved vaccination tenders and data protection policies, the continuity was not cosmetic. Both eras understood that logistics win campaigns, and that the care of bodies wounded at Lepanto or dehydrated in a refugee camp demands command, not sentiment. The liturgical life, so easy to caricature as ceremonial residue, proved operationally relevant. Ritual kept teams coherent under stress. It reminded professionals and volunteers alike that their craft belonged to a longer continuity than any single deployment. The 9 centuries of prayer did not equip a surgeon to suture faster, but they bound a clinic's staff into a fraternity that could endure fatigue and ambiguity without fraying. The catechesis of the rule, in its modern dress, still taught that command obeys a higher accountability than efficiency alone. That is why the Order's hospitals maintain ethics committees, and why its procurement policies can look conservative. The memory of past scandals counsels an asceticism of governance. What then remains of the old warrior? The answer is not nothing. Strategy persists. The Order still thinks in campaigns and networks, still prizes discipline and chain of command, still invests in strongpoints. Only now the strongpoints are supply hubs, data systems and training schools. The medieval fortress taught depth by concentric walls. The modern order teaches depth by layered competencies: medical, legal, diplomatic and pastoral. The Hospitaller of 1250 would recognize the seriousness, if not the tools, of the Hospitaller of today. This is not to romanticize the modern era. Controversies have erupted over governance reform, relations with the Holy See, and the admissibility of this or that policy in complex public health contexts. Yet even these crises, messy as they are, underscore a paradoxical strength. A body that can be argued with is a body alive enough to reform. The Order's sovereignty, always sui generis, now depends less on unanimity than on a constitutional metabolism that can absorb conflict, adjudicate it, and continue the work. And the vow of hospitality, central since Jerusalem, has not dimmed. It has expanded beyond the sickbed to include the refugee queue, the shelter cot, the hunger line, the lonely elder's kitchen table. In these theatres, the Order's ancient genius for institutionalizing mercy continues to innovate. Digital triage tools sit next to rosaries in volunteer bags. Paperless medical records travel with a mother across borders and languages. A knight in black mantle can brief a health minister at noon and carry a stretcher at dusk. The world's needs change. The grammar of response does not see, judge, plan, serve. Thus the arc from 1798 to the present is not a story of decline after glory, but of transfiguration under pressure. The Order shed its forts and fleets, and recovered its first name, Hospitaller. It learned to be sovereign in order to serve better, not to rule more. It rebuilt legitimacy, not by retaking Malta, but by taking responsibility again and again for the abandoned and the wounded. It discovered that the most impregnable citadel it could build was the trust of patients and partners, won in thousands of small, exacting acts, and it proved, across 2 difficult centuries, that an institution can outlive its materials when it guards its rule, renews its purpose, and keeps its hands at the work for which it was founded, to receive the stranger as Christ, and to make of mercy an order. Every fortress the Hospitallers ever raised could fall to siege, starvation, treachery, or time. What did not fall was the grammar that made 1,000 men move with one intention, the rule that governed them, the right that bound them, and the ranks that specified who held which keys. If Chapter 7 traced how the Order learned to project power without territory, this chapter descends into the engine room that made such projection possible in the first place. To understand the Hospitallers across centuries is to watch an institution condense its soul into repeatable forms, prayer hours, audits, visitations, professions of vows, admissions, promotions, until stability ceased to depend on stone. The rule came first. In Jerusalem, when the Hospital of St. John was little more than a disciplined charity attached to a church, the community hardened its habits into obligations. Day began before light and ended after. The sick were not a category, but a command. From the earliest statutes, the order's leadership understood the difference between kindness and governance. Kindness is a virtue. Governance is a system. Systems survive storms. They wrote down times for the office, distribution of bread and wine, allotments of linen, protocols for the washing of feet, the keeping of inventories, the roles of the cellarer, almoner, infirmarian. Each line made mercy scale. The poor were served because the servers were supervised. Rites saturated rule. Liturgy did not hover above logistics. It saturated them. The liturgical year, Advent's restraint, Lent's long correction, Easter's blaze became a metronome for planning. The procession was not an ornament, but a declaration of order. Cross before banner, chaplain before commander, brethren 2 by 2, each in the place the chapter had assigned. When they reached a bed, words learned by heart placed the sick person and the caregiver in a meaning deeper than their pain. The vow the Hospitaller made, obedience, chastity, poverty, hospitality, did not turn him into a saint. It turned his time into property of the work. He ate when the bell allowed, he travelled when sent. He held no office without accountability to the chapter that could review, rebuke, or remove him. Rank clarified responsibility. The Grand Master was the hinge, but not a monarch in the modern sense. His power derived from, and was constrained by, a council of senior officers whose portfolios divided the world of the Order into governable parts. The Grand Commander guarded spiritual discipline and internal coherence. The Grand Hospitaller oversaw the actual practice that gave the Order its name. The Grand Chancellor kept the Order's face to the world, diplomacy, chancery, seals, archives. The receiver of the common treasure was the accountant who turned vows into ledgers and promises into solvency. Below them lay priors, bailiffs, commanders, and the dense web of conventual officers who made harbour lists, match victual stores, and patient rosters, match pharmacy stocks. No one, from Rhodes to Rome, functioned without a superior who asked for a report at a specified time. At the level of the individual, the Hospitaller life began with admission, never casual. Aspirants had to show proofs, birth, baptism, often nobility, depending on era and lang, more importantly, a capacity for the life. The romance of a black mantle with a white cross hid a practical question: could this person obey, serve, endure? Formation was not just catechesis, it was apprenticeship in discipline. The novice learned how to kneel, how to bind a wound, how to lift a stretcher without wrenching his back, how to inventory a storeroom so that nothing essential ran out at the wrong hour. He learned to keep silence where it was required, not to dramatize himself in the ward, and to let the sick person's dignity lead the room. He learned that the ritual wash of hands before the distribution of food or medicine was about more than hygiene. It was an enacted theology. The work is holy. The worker must approach as one purified. The famed langues, the national tongues into which the Order organized itself, were solutions to a real administrative problem: how to make a transcontinental multilingual body resilient and fundable. By grouping brethren and properties into 8 great divisions, each with its own residences, recruits and endowments, the Order turned the diversity of Europe into a machine for service at the centre. Each lang had its capitular life, its internal officers, its fundraising habits. When called, they sent men, grain, silver, surgeons. When abused by local politics, they nonetheless preserved continuity. When a king attempted to capture an entire lang under national control, the rest of the order could still function. The medieval genius here was redundancy. No single blow should disable the body. That same redundancy extended to law. The Hospitallers did not merely have a rule, they had visitations in courts. Inspectors, visitors, arrived unannounced, examined ledgers, inspected pantries, questioned staff, listened to grievances, and issued corrections. The visitor had power to suspend, to recommend removal, to impose penance. Appeals lay to higher chapter. The effect was decisive. A commander on a remote estate could not consider his post a sinecure. A hospital master in a city could not quietly lower standards to save coin. A grandmaster could not drift without the risk of collective rebuke. This legal metabolism did not prevent corruption. No system can, but it made recovery possible. When the order misstepped, there existed mechanisms to confess, correct, and restore. The spiritual economy of the order often confuses the modern eye. Why insist upon the choir office for men who also ran fleets and hospitals? Because singing the same psalms at the same hours across continents kept a wildly dispersed body in time. The choir created a daily commons stronger than any memorandum. It also taught patience. Submitting one's urgency to the psalm allotted for that hour formed a certain kind of leader. The man who can keep silence while the room finishes the Gloria Patri is the man who can wait for intelligence before committing a squadron. The chaplain's role, often understated in martial histories, ran through everything. Preaching that cut through self-deception, confession that prevented minor resentments from metastasizing into schism, the sacramental crowning of the sickbed, where every motive is laid bare. Women appear in this inner life not as exceptions, but as vital partners. From early confraternities to later recognized classes of dames, lay women under promises, and sometimes vows, operated hospices, raised funds, trained nurses, and carried the order's charism into places where a man in a mantle would be an intrusion. In many cities, the face of St. John to the poor was a woman who understood both the grammar of the rule and the improvisation mercy sometimes requires. Their presence made the institution honest. It cannot claim to serve the whole body of Christ if half that body is missing from the work of governance and care. The Hospitaller habit, black with the 8-pointed cross, did more than identify. Clothing turned the private virtue of hospitality into a public promise. To wear the cross in the ward was to invite scrutiny. Do you behave as that cross declares? Over centuries, the 8 points gathered catechesis. One tradition reads them as the 8 Beatitudes, a compact spiritual syllabus for men and women who wanted their competence to rise from conviction. Beatitude shaped bedside manner. Bedside manner shaped the order's reputation. Reputation generated trust. Trust opened doors that money could not. When the order later negotiated passage for convoys across a front line or customs clearance for medical cargo at midnight, the real collateral was not diplomatic paper. It was accumulated memory, the cross seen in earthquake rubble, in a cholera camp, in the quiet hour of death. Finances, too, belong to the inner life. There is no mercy at scale without money counted to the last florin, scudo, lira, or euro. Medieval charters endowed lands, mills, fisheries, rental houses. Later boards balanced gifts, legacies, public grants. The receiver of the common treasure and his staff did unglamorous labour, audits, tenders, depreciation schedules, risk registers. They were despised when they said no, celebrated when a hospital thrived, invisible when everything worked. Yet the lay of their ledgers determined whether a hospital ward had soap by spring. The more the order professionalized, the more it wrote down what had once been learned by osmosis. Procurement guidelines, conflict of interest rules, whistleblower protections. Critics called this bureaucratization. Realists called it penance, acted out in spreadsheets, a sober reply to past scandals, a vow renewed in compliance language. Education tied the whole organism together. The order made schools of its hospitals, not because it loved abstraction, but because it hated dependency. A system that cannot reproduce its skills will soon be forced to buy them at prices it cannot afford, or beg for them at moments it cannot control. From Rhodes to Malta to Rome to global associations, the hospitalers trained their own. Surgeons apprenticed surgeons, logisticians took on assistants, chaplains formed new chaplains with the hard counsel born of mistakes. Manuals were written, then revised. In our era, the same instinct builds e-learning modules, simulation labs, and field exercises where disaster is rehearsed so that, when it comes, the triage tags move in the practiced order and not in the panic of guesswork. To an outsider, a drill looks theatrical. To a hospitaller, it is liturgy by other means, repetition that shapes reflex. Conflicts did not cease at the chapel door. The very strengths of the body became fault lines. The langrus, so effective at gathering resources, periodically hardened into national lobbies. Reformers pushed to centre the professed religious. Administrators replied that hospitals close without managers. Devout zeal strained against professional caution. Professional caution accused zeal of naivete. On good days, this dialectic forged better policy. On bad days, it produced standoffs, resignations, and scandal. The inner life survived because beneath even sharp disputes, the shared rule remained. Men and women who have kept vigil together at a bedside can fight over statutes without forgetting why they fight. The memory of the ward policy's ambition. You cannot mistake the purpose of rank if you have carried a stretcher. What then did obedience mean in practice? In a world that prizes self-expression, the hospitaller vow can sound like self-erasure. It isn't. Obedience in this tradition is the art that keeps a complex mission from splintering into vanity projects. It is the promise that one will submit personal preference to corporate discernment, so that the sick, not the self, remain the centre. When a prior assigns a volunteer to inventory catheters instead of frontline triage, obedience transforms disappointment into contribution. When a grandmaster must resign to preserve the peace of the body, obedience turns humiliation into gift. These are not sentimental moves. They are the hard reasons an institution survives its charismatic founders, its best centuries, its worst embarrassments. Finally, the inner life of the order preserved something older than the order itself. The Christian conviction that service to the vulnerable is not a technique, but a theology. That conviction was not used as a cudgel against the unbelieving. It became a discipline among believers. The brethren examined consciences before great feasts, not as pious ornament, but as a management practice. A guilty man cheats, a resentful woman cuts corners, a proud officer refuses correction. Sin is not a word that modern health systems like the Hospitallers use it, because they have seen what unconfessed vanity does to a ward. Their rite named the disease, so the rule could prescribe a cure. If you strip away the banners and plaques, the honours and disputes, what remains at the core of the Hospitaller engine is a sequence that never goes out of date. Look at reality without flinching. Submit that reality to a rule that was built to hold the weight of human need. Pray until your motives stop lying to you. Count the money. Train the next person. Accept correction. Keep the hour. Keep the inventory. Keep going. And here is the paradox that explains their longevity. The more the order invested in this invisible machinery, confession, audit, visitation, formation, the more visible its mercy became. The public saw ambulances, clinics, and volunteers. What they did not see, and did not need to see, were the early mornings, the reread minutes, the small humiliations endured for peace, the decisions to decline a donor whose money arrived with strings that would strangle the work a year hence. That is the inner life's triumph. It lets the outer works flourish without becoming their prisoner. In the centuries ahead, the order's sovereignty will be tested by changes it cannot control. Shifting diplomatic norms, new pandemics, moral controversies that slice across alliances and consciences. The only adequate reply will not be a louder press release, but a deeper fidelity to the grammar that brought them this far. The rule will need revision again, the right will need translation again, the ranks will need to make room again for unexpected talent, including those who do not fit the old social assumptions, but who burn with the same patient charity. If they manage that, the order will continue to do what it has always done at its best: take the ancient scandal of mercy and make it operational. You do not need bastions to do that. You need a people who believe that a bell rung at dawn matters, that a ledger reconciled to the last coin protects the weak, that a prayer said over a bed is a promise to return with the right medicine at the right time, that rank exists to distribute responsibility, not to hoard status, that a rule is a freedom because it relieves the worker of improvising every morning whether to be faithful today. This is the architecture that outlived Rhodes and Malta. This is why the cross still appears where sirens pierce the night. If you want the true measure of the Hospitallers, do not start at a battlement. Start in a ward. The order's name was never a metaphor. From its first century in Jerusalem to its last great hospitals in Valletta, the Knights of St. John left a paper and stone trail of kitchens, pharmacies, laundries, anatomical theatres, lazarettos, and rules of diet. In those places the romance of chivalry was translated into linen counts, apothecary inventories, and the quiet governance of suffering. The result is history you can still walk: long halls, drilled apertures for ventilation, drains cut to carry foul water away from beds. The fortress gets the postcard, the ward explains the survival. The Jerusalem hospital took form before the order was a military power at all. Pilgrim traffic into the holy city, some sick on arrival, many more made sick by travel, required discipline rather than enthusiasm. Early statutes associated with the first masters, and the observations of chroniclers who saw the place, converge on a picture of method: separation of men and women into distinct wards, beds arranged so that attendants could move easily, a kitchen running to a schedule, a chapel close enough that priests could bring the sacrament without parading through the whole house. The language of the rule is not sentimental. It reads like a logistics manual baptized. The sick are to be received as Christ himself. Therefore they are to be washed, clothed, and fed. Therefore the cellarer must keep stock. Therefore the almoner must account for alms. Therefore the infirmarian must ensure quiet at night. Piety is the premise. Procedure is the conclusion. Food reveals the theology. The order did not starve the sick in the name of edification. On the contrary, the statutes lay down generous dietaries by medieval standards: fresh white bread where possible, wine cut with water, meat for those whom the physician judged it, would strengthen suspended in the great fasts unless illness required dispensation, eggs, broths, and potages when digestion was fragile, fruit in season, sugar syrups and electuaries when the pharmacy could get them. Linen mattered, clean sheets were not a luxury, they were an assertion that the patient's body deserved honour. Attendants were to wash feet, trim nails, change garments. Men and women who lived under vows took on the indignities someone else could not manage alone, and they did so by schedule, because mercy unplanned collapses under volume. Medicine in this world followed the humoral theory, and the hospitaller pharmacy reflects it. Shelves held cinnamon, cloves, pepper, mastic, myrrh, aloe, galangal, scammony, senna, saffron, and the sugars that were both medicine and preservative. Syrups and juleps were compounded to cool or warm, to moisten or dry, to draw off what the physician judged to be in excess. One does not need to endorse the physics to respect the discipline. Apothecaries kept books. The infirmarian signed for what was issued. Spices spoiled, resins hardened, glass shattered on the road in from the port. Supply was a craft, and if a ship came in with a damaged cargo of pepper, there had to be coin to replace, and a donor's promise that could be called in without offence. The receiver of the common treasure, a title that sounds like fiction until you watch him talk to a pharmacist about an overdue shipment, appears in the ward by way of the ledger that pays for a bale of cotton for bandages. Surgery, more than any other craft, shows the order's capacity to learn by accumulation. In Jerusalem, and later at Acre and Cyprus after the first loss of the Holy City, surgeons worked with the tools of their time: scalpels, saws, trephines, forceps, cautery irons heated to arrest bleeding. Wounds from arrows and blades were ordinary. Broken bones from falls and carts were just as common. There were poultices for infected flesh, wine used as an antiseptic wash before surgeons knew the word, and cautions against closing a wound too early, lest corruption be sealed in. The difference between a hospital or infirmary and a makeshift camp is not a miracle, but a system. Instruments boiled when fuel allowed, cloths washed and dried in air, attendants trained to keep flies off meat and wounds alike. No one in the order wrote germ theory. They observed practice that, however the theory lagged, saved lives. When the order moved to Rhodes in the 14th century, medicine moved with it to sea. The hospital became maritime. Galleys carried their own chests of drugs, bandages and tools. Galley surgeons learned to work with the pitch and roll of the deck. Commanders learned that healthy crews were as decisive as bronze cannon. Diet changed with the theatre, hardtack and salted meat on campaign, but citruses prized when they could be had. The famines and fevers of blockade taught hard lessons. Waterfowls, grain moulds, discipline in the hold matters as much as discipline at the oar. The order's statutes were amended again and again to specify what officers must check, what stores must be replaced before mould, what to do with a man fevered at sea. When plague came in Rhodes, and in the wider Mediterranean, the order learned a new art that would later become one of its signatures: quarantine. Quarantine is not romantic. It is the bureaucracy of patience, the decision to hold a ship at a distance, to wait the number of days the magistrate fixes, first in 10s, then in 40s as custom hardened, to inspect bills of health, to air cargo, to disinfect by smoke or vinegar, to watch the crew on an island or in a cordoned facility before letting them ashore. The knights did not invent the practice, but by the 17th century they had made it architectural. On the Mars-Mexet side of Malta, the lazaretto established in the 1640s turned a harbour into a membrane. Goods were aired on racks, letters were smoked to kill what might be carried in paper folds, convalescents were housed under rules that looked like monasticism, with thermometers. These measures did not always succeed. No human system before antibiotics and vaccines could guarantee safety, but they prove an institutional instinct the order had honed since Jerusalem. If a danger can be managed by rules, write the rules, build the rooms, and enforce the waiting. Valletta's Sacra Infermaria made that instinct monumental. The long ward running in a single hall, whose length astonishes even jaded travellers, was laid out for supervision, light and air. Windows cut high admitted illumination without drafts on bodies. The kitchen was connected by corridors that allowed food to arrive hot, without dragging smoke into the beds. The pharmacy stood close enough for the physician to walk between compounding and consultation. For a time, the old co-cathedral and the hospital shared painters and patrons. The same generation that could commission a ceiling for worship could pay for a ceiling whose geometry made cleaning easier. The point is not piety disguised as architecture. It is competence made visible. A ward that places beds head to foot along a spine of space with ample aisles lets a small staff watch many without losing the intimacy of attention. The 17th century brought a more formal pedagogy. In 1676, the order established an anatomical theatre and a school of surgery in Valletta under the patronage of Grand Master Nicola Cotoner. That decision matters because it shows the order acknowledging, within its own walls, that experience was not enough. Surgeons needed structured training, disputes needed refereeing by teachers, and young practitioners required a place to watch and to be tested. Anatomy lessons in that theatre did not overturn ancient authorities overnight, but they did habituate men to cut, to observe, to diagram, and to argue from what they had seen instead of what they had been told. Over time, those habits changed outcomes on tables in the ward below. The order, which had always been a school of obedience, admitted that it also had to become a school of evidence. Records from Valletta reveal an attention to specialties before the word was used. There were surgeons who concentrated on bone and joint, others more adept with the belly, a few remembered for steadiness under the eye's delicate structures. There were midwives serving the poor of the city, sometimes trained under the hospital's patronage, and foundling wheels and homes in which abandoned infants were taken in, baptized and placed with nurses under supervision. The hospitallers did not restrict mercy to male soldiers. City poor, widows, the old without kin, these stood in the doorway with the same claim. When a plague threatened or a fever ran through the port, the rules flexed, beds multiplied, screens erected, visiting restricted, chaplains assigned to the sick in greater number, with warnings not to linger longer than sacraments required. A hospital that can change shape in a week is not a building, it is a choir that knows another piece by heart. There is a legend that all enemies were treated and then converted by gratitude. The truth is both humbler and harder. Prisoners of war and wounded foes did receive care, sometimes to the astonishment of men raised on mutual hatreds. But the order did not run a mission disguised as a ward. Chaplains served the faithful, others were not compelled. The motive was not public relations. It was the vow, the sick as Christ, not the sick as opportunity. In practice, this ethic had political effects. Ottoman commanders knew that their wounded, if captured alive, might live. Merchants judged that the lazaretto, however strict, would not extort. Diplomats wrote notes to the Grand Hospital and received reasoned replies about days, fumigations, and the release of goods. Over years, such habits created a reservoir of trust, a fortress alone cannot store. The economics of all this were relentless. A hospital eats money. Bread, meat, fish, oil, candles, vinegar, soap, lime for whitewash, sheets, blankets, pots, pans, knives, tinder, coal, wood, glass panes smashed by stones or cracked by heat, barrels, ropes, mattresses, straw to stuff them, carts to move waste, beasts to pull the carts, wages for servants, stipends for physicians and surgeons, pensions for those too injured to serve again. All of it had to be paid. The order funded this avalanche by rents from rural estates, dues from commanderies across Europe, gifts and bequests specified in wills, fees levied on commerce. Auditors went out, commandery masters came in to report, disputes were settled over whether a prior had spent what statutes allowed on a new roof, rather than the hospital chest. If this sounds tedious, it is the tedium that keeps beds filled with something other than promises. Cleanliness and air became obsessions for good reason. Valletta sits under a sun that can flare into oven heat, and a ward without breeze becomes an engine of rot. The long hall's design, windows placed for cross-ventilation, high ceilings to pull heat up, wall plaster regularly whitewashed with lime, combated the physics. Cisterns fed by roof runoff provided water that had to be rationed and kept from fouling. Latrines were engineered to carry waste away from the hospital down to the sea. When storms broke drains, repair was immediate, because the ward's health rides on the least glamorous pipe. When the order's physicians argued about fevers, they argued also about air and stench. They were wrong in theory and often right in practice. Close the shutters and death took a larger share. The ward governed character. A knight who had spent nights among the beds tended to speak differently in chapter. He had seen the way a poor man's dignity depends upon the simple gifts. A basin offered without hurry, a sheet not tugged as if time were wasted. The decision to change a dressing even when the bell for the office was about to ring. Men trained to steer galleys learned to steer human fear in families waiting outside doors. Administrators fluent with grants learned why the kitchen must have authority over a clerk who delays an order to save a coin. Chaplains learned that a sermon is not a lecture. It is the difference between a man swallowing broth and pushing the spoon away. When the order debated tactics or budgets, memory of this room kept rhetoric honest. You cannot praise the poor abstractly after emptying a bedpan. When the order lost Malta in 1798, the Sacra Infermeria became a fossil of a living thing, yet what had been learned in its halls did not die. The 19th and 20th centuries, amid all their upheavals, rewarded institutions that could turn compassion into protocol. The Hospitallers were ready. They had been writing and revising protocols for 700 years. What changed were the tools. Chloroform hung where once a cautery iron glowed. Sterilizers hissed where once boilers merely softened cloth. X-rays showed fractures no palpation could read. Vaccines ended fevers that had haunted harbours for centuries. The rule, receive, wash, feed, treat, record, review, needed only new verbs. Receive became triage, wash became asepsis, feed became nutrition, treat became surgery and pharmacology, record became charts, review became audit and quality control. The melody did not change, the instrumentation did. There is a temptation to say that the knights became modern when they built the anatomy theatre, or when they established a quarantine island, or when they learnt to issue statistical reports. The truer statement is that their original vow contained a modernity that centuries would only bring into focus, the belief that love of the sick is not a feeling but a discipline, and that disciplines can be taught, revised, and handed on. In Jerusalem, that conviction took the form of white bread placed by a bed at the right hour. In Valletta, it took the form of a corridor swept at dawn, and an instrument boiled before a cut. In our day, it takes the form of cold chain vaccines that arrive potent because a generator started in the night, and a nurse checked the dial in the dark. Different centuries, same vow. The hospital, seen this way, is not an appendage to the order's story. It is the story's proof. The hospitalers fought at sea because the sea brought the sick. They built forts because forts protected wards. They wrote constitutions because constitutions prevent the weak from being sacrificed to the strong, when money runs thin. And when their forts fell and their ships were seized, they survived because the skills that keep a ward alive can be practiced anywhere a door can be opened and a bed placed near it. A people that knows how to fold linen and change a dressing at the hour appointed is very hard to kill. Walk the long hall in Valletta today, and you will hear the after-echo of that competence. The stone remembers footsteps at regular intervals, the creak of a cartwheel, the low voice of a chaplain at the side of a man who cannot sleep, the kitchen's call when broth is ready, the surgeon's instruction to hold a lamp steady, the wash of the floor at dawn when a night's sweat is erased. In that sound is the order's claim to continuity. Not the trumpet, not the gun, not the diplomatic signature, but the modest music of a place where the sick were expected and, being expected, were served. That is hospitality made visible. That is the architecture that outlasted empires. The order did not become a maritime power by accident. The sea forced its hand. When the Hospitallers seized Rhodes in the early 14th century, after a grinding campaign completed under Grandmaster Fulk de Villaret in 1309 to 1310, they stepped from the infirmary onto a stage where wind, timber, and ore would decide their survival. On an island astride the routes between Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean, they could no longer pretend to be only Hospitallers with swords. They had to become admirals and shipwrights, quartermasters and hydrographers, without losing the ward-side discipline that had defined them since Jerusalem. For 2.5 centuries at Rhodes, and then for a generation at Malta, the Order's fleet and its fortresses learned to breathe with one set of lungs. Rhodes made the hospital maritime. The convent community of the professed sat inside walls whose angles anticipated gunpowder, straddling harbours where galleys berthed sterndore, their rams jutting over water that smelled of pitch and brine. The Lungis that had organised revenue and recruitment across Europe now organised the waterfront. Each maintained an auberge, a house and refectory that doubled as a recruiting depot and a logistical cell. Novices and knights owed caravan service at sea, a season or multiple seasons under an experienced captain, learning not merely to fight but to keep a galley alive, how to stow ballast, ration water, splice a rope in the dark, and read a shoreline when a squall erased the horizon. Caravans were not romance, they were apprenticeship in reality. The Order's ships evolved with the Mediterranean. Galleys formed the core, long, low, oared warships, capable of sprint and shock, their beaks and artillery designed to decide a fight at pistol-shot range. By the 15th century, heavier sailing vessels, carracks, and later galleons crept into the Order's inventory for transport, supply, and the occasional line of battle role. But the galley remained the nerve. The galley's anatomy shaped command. A knight might nominally outrank a professional mariner on a storm night, rank bowed to experience. The master pilot and boatswain governed the thousand small acts, reefing, sounding, trimming that keep men and hulls out of the sea's mouth. The order's statutes reflected this humility in practice. Officers were named, penalties for neglect were specified, prizes were divided by rule to prevent mutiny by disappointment. Corsair war defined the daily rhythm. Enemy captains, Turkish, Greek, North African, harried Christian coasts. Christian captains harried theirs in reply. The order did not pretend to be outside this economy of violence. It patrolled, escorted, intercepted. It also raided, seized prizes, and manned galleys with chained convicts and slaves at the oars, as other navies did. The moral logic expressed in chanceries and sermons was defensive. Protect pilgrims and trade, punish piracy, interrupt Ottoman logistics. The material logic was simple. The fleet had to be paid. Prizes, hulls, cargoes, ransoms, funded rope, canvas, iron, food, and pay. The receiver of the common treasure counted winnings with the same care he counted arms for the infirmary. If a commander exceeded rules or abused captives, he could be called to account. The order knew that the line between crusade and crime is a ledge in fog. Fortification became the order's other language. At Rhodes, they refaced medieval walls for cannon, lowered profiles, thickened earthworks, and created killing zones. Bastions were assigned to Langres, France, Auvergne, Provence, Aragon, Castile, Italy, Germany, England, whose brethren were expected to maintain their sectors and man them in a siege. This division was not ceremonial. It created responsibility that could be inspected and blamed. Visitors from Italy and France recorded the order's relentless repairs, mortar mixed, embrasures widened for culverins, counterscarp revetted. The hospital sat within this world not as an adornment, but as a purpose for the walls. Powder magazines exist to keep roofs over wards. The first great crisis at Rhodes came in 1440 four-way Mamluk pressure, and more decisively in 1480, when Sultan Mehmed II's army and fleet assaulted the island. Grand Master Pierre d'Aubusson directed a defence whose detail shows a bureaucracy prepared for catastrophe. Muster rolls were current, gunpowder was not a rumour, reliefs ran by hour and bell. When a breach opened in the Tower of Italy's sector, counterattacks sealed it with bodies and rubble. Disease killed as surely as iron. The order's hospital discipline, latrines, water rationing, segregation of the fevered, chanced to hold death to a rate that let men still climb to the wall. The Ottomans lifted the siege after weeks of slaughter. Rhodes survived, but only for a time. Solomon Ife, young and ambitious, returned in 1522 with an artillery park and engineers who understood how stone fails under mathematics. Grandmaster Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam faced the kind of siege gunpowder had made decisive. Saps advanced under earth, mines kissed foundations, batteries pounded parapets to dust, sorties bled men without changing geometry. The order's diaries from that winter carry the sound of a fortress decaying in slow motion. Bastions named phalanges were chewed to shape, countermines blasted air that tasted of sulphur and earth, chaplains gave absolution in casemates. By December, the calculus was over. With the city broken and the civilian population exhausted, the knights negotiated capitulation that honoured resistance, safe conduct, the right to carry relics, archives, and a portion of arms and treasure. On 1 January 1523, the Hospitallers left the island they had made their school. Exile could have dissolved them. Instead, the institutional muscle memory rule right rank carried them through itinerant years in Italy until an improbable grant in 1530 offered a base Emperor Charles V, with papal assent, invested the order with Malta, Gozo and Tripoli as a fief of the Spanish crown in Sicily. The terms were not romantic, a falcon annually to the Viceroy of Sicily, feudal obligations acknowledged, and a frontier position staring at the central Mediterranean lanes used by Ottoman fleets and Barbary corsairs. Tripoli was a forward outpost, more liability than asset, Malta was a stone ship without wood or water to spare, but it was a hull, and the order knew how to fit a hull for sea. They surveyed with an engineer's eye Burgo Vittoriosa and Sengler, twin peninsulas jutting into the Grand Harbour, became Hive and Strongpoint. The older fort at St. Angelo was strengthened. A new fort, St. Elmo, went up on the Marsa-Mexet barrier at the tip of the Cerberus Peninsula to dominate the harbour mouths. Later, after catastrophe taught its lesson, Valletta itself would crown that ridge. The lazaretto would come in the 1640s. For now, the priorities were guns, granaries, a dockyard, and a hospital capable of absorbing what the sea would pour onto its beds. Water was life. Cisterns multiplied under courtyards and streets. Statutes specified measurements. Inspectors struck masons for sloppy lime. Without water, no galley leaves its pier. Without water, a siege ends before it begins. Tripoli fell in 1551. The grant of 1530 had included that North African station, useful if you could afford it, fatal if you could not. Dragut, Turgut Reis, the great Ottoman corsair and admiral, exploited the order's weakness. Sinan Pasha and Dragut besieged Tripoli. The garrison under Gaspard de Valliere resisted. Relief failed. The city capitulated. The fall was a humiliation in European eyes, and a sober audit inside the order. They were not a great Mediterranean state. They were a military-religious corporation, with thin manpower and tighter coin. The lesson they took was practical. Malta must be defended to the last stone, and the fleet must be used asymmetrically. Raids, intercepts, intelligence, rather than in grand fleet actions the order could not sustain alone. 2 years later, in 1553, and again in 1555, Dragut tested Malta's periphery. In 1551, parallel with Tripoli, he had raided Gozo, carrying off thousands into slavery, and leaving the island a shell. These were not separate stories but one. The central Mediterranean had become a chessboard of punitive strikes, kidnappings, and sudden sieges. In response, the order hardened the harbour complex and increased caravans. The young Jean Parisot de Valette, future Grand Master, made his reputation in this crucible, a hard, pious, disciplined commander formed by years of sea service, prison, and administrative grind. He understood that the order's survival would hang on administrative finesse as much as on heroics, and on the hard choice to spend coin on unglamorous works before the trumpet sounded. The trumpet finally sounded in 1565. Suleiman, aging but determined to close a vexing Christian thorn, sent a force under Lala Mustafa Pasha, with naval command under Piale Pasha and Dragut. Modern estimates vary, but the besieging strength Ottoman infantry, artillery, sappers, and corsair contingents outnumbered the defenders by an order of magnitude. Valette had perhaps 500 to 600 fully professed knights, a few thousand mercenaries and militia, and the island's population to sustain the works and carry water. The order's fortification scheme would be tested to destruction. The siege opened with a brutal geometry. The Ottomans decided to reduce Fort St. Elmo first. That shoal of stone guarded the entrances to both Marsa-Mexet and the Grand Harbour. So long as St. Elmo lived, Ottoman galleys could not lie safely under its guns. Batteries emplaced on the heights of Mount Sybaris and on Tignes pummeled the small fort. The defenders, knights and soldiers rotated from Birgu and Senglia by night across water, under fire, held for weeks beyond expectation. Dragut was killed by counter-battery splinters or a mis-aimed Ottoman piece. Accounts differ, but Ottoman morale felt the blow. Still, on 23 June, after an impossible attrition, St. Elmo fell, its surviving defenders killed on the breach. It had bought time, and time is the one commodity a beleaguered fortress can spend profitably. With St. Elmo gone, the siege closed on Birgo and Senglia. The Ottomans attempted a combined thrust, assaults by land while galleys forced the harbour to flank the peninsulas. Here engineering decided a day. The order had quietly stretched a floating barrier, chains and timbers across the inner harbour, Ottoman galleys that tried to force it at dawn met entanglement and point-blank cannon. On land, massive mines under the bastions opened craters filled at once by counterattacks. The great assault of 7 August cracked the Senglea bastion. Only a combination of pike, shot, and the personal presence of Valette, remarkably visible, chainmail shirt beneath his mantle, sealed the gap. In September, a second massive assault again brought the defenders within minutes of defeat, before reserve companies and desperate sorties rebalanced the field. Malta's hinterland mattered as much as the walls. Mdina, the old inland city, executed a cavalry sortie against Ottoman foragers that forced the besiegers to allocate more strength to protecting their own supply. A small tactical event with large strategic ripples. Disease gnawed at both camps. The Order's hospital discipline and short interior lines marginally favoured the defenders. Water held, ammunition held barely, with cannon barrels bursting from overuse and powder rationed by the receiver, who had done his sums in spring. Relief came not as a deus ex machina, but as a late-arriving duty. Spanish-led forces from Sicily, delayed by politics, logistics, and the perennial risk calculus of great powers, landed in mid-September at St. Paul's Bay. Their numbers were not overwhelming, but the Ottoman army, exhausted and running short before winter seas cut their lines, could not spend more blood to take the peninsulas. The besiegers withdrew in broken order. The Great Siege of Malta had ended, and Europe, hungry for a story of resistance, read the reports as proof that Ottoman advance could be checked by stone, nerve, and faith. What followed was not triumphal languor, but a lesson written in ash and lime. Valette and his engineers began at once what the siege had recommended, a new city on the Scaberus Ridge, named Valletta in his honour, designed as an artillery-age fortress from the ground up. Straight streets caught sea wind for health and fire control. Bastions and cavaliers were keyed to one another in a geometry that multiplied fields of fire. Magazines, cisterns, and the great hospital, the Sacra Infermaria, were planned as parts of a single organism. The lazaretto would later complete the medical logic of the harbour by turning quarantine into architecture. The city's founding in 1566 is often presented as a flourish of victory. It was really an act of institutional memory. Write the siege's requirements into stone so the next generation will not need heroism to compensate for defects. The Order's war at sea did not end in 1565. It adapted. The fleet resumed caravans, escorts, and raids. Knights sailed with allied squadrons in the long contest that culminated at Lepanto in 1571. The Order's contingent was small beside the Spanish and Venetian masses, but present another thread in the Christian coalition that shattered an Ottoman fleet and reset the psychology of the sea, even if ports and fortresses on the littoral remained contested for a century. Malta's harbour grew into an effective naval base. The arsenal repaired hulls and cast shot. The granaries and cisterns turned siege famine into a controllable risk rather than a certainty. Meanwhile, the hospital expanded its long ward, pharmacy, and curriculum, binding the Order's identity to care with renewed confidence. The sword and the stretcher, never cleanly separable in the Order's life, remained yoked, but the balance had shifted. After 1565, the fortress and fleet existed unmistakably to protect the hospital and the island that sustained it. Accuracy requires admitting costs. The Order's corsairing could be predatory. Its galleys used forced labour like every navy of its day. Its politics intertwined with dynastic and papal interests that sometimes bent its mission to serve patrons. Yet the strategic through-line from Rhodes to Malta is not hard to read. The Hospitallers learnt to use limited means for decisive ends, delay an enemy here to protect a ward there, build a small fort in spring to save a city in autumn, enforce a quarantine today so a fleet can sail next month, spend a prize on lime and cisterns rather than on banners and feasts. They were not the largest actor in the Mediterranean War, but they learnt to be the hardest to remove from the board. By the time Valette died in 1568, the Order had remade itself twice by the same method. Write down what the last disaster taught. Put coin behind the line items that are easy to postpone and ruinous to neglect. Train novices until reflex replaces rhetoric. Build stone that multiplies the reach of a few disciplined men. Keep the hospital as the conscience that prevents the fortress from becoming an idol. The Hospitallers did not defeat the Ottoman Empire. No island could. They forced a great empire to price them into its plans, sometimes to bleed for a rock that should have been cheap, and to watch as a small brotherhood turned the logistics of medicine, water, and grain into a strategy as potent as any fleet list. Fortress and fleet, seen from the ward, look different than they do from a parade. The bastion is a windbreak for a convalescent. The galley is a courier for a surgeon. The chain across the harbour is a guarantee that the kitchen fires will not be extinguished by an enemy's prow at dawn. From Rhodes to Malta, and through the summer of 1565, the Knights Hospitaller proved that a maritime order could use violence without letting violence define it. They left a harbour that could heal and a city that breathed in regular blocks because their books and their bells synchronized the energies of men who otherwise might have spent themselves in gestures. The sea taught them tempo, the hospital taught them purpose, the walls taught them humility before geometry, and when the storm passed, what remained was not a legend but a set of plans any competent generation could take up and improve. Before a galley could cut a wake or a hospital ladle out broth, someone far away had to harvest wheat, lease a mill, sign a receipt, and send coin toward the convent. That is the unromantic backbone of the Knights of St. John. From the 12th century until the Age of Revolutions, the order survived because it converted scattered European real estate into a single Mediterranean capability. It did this by law, by habit, and by a bureaucracy that learned to be boring on purpose. This chapter follows the quiet power, estates and commanderies, dues and audits, privileges and courts, how the order turned fields in Burgundy, houses in Barcelona, forests in the Rhineland, and vineyards in Sicily into gunpowder, flour, linen, and pay at Jerusalem, Rhodes and Malta. Start with the map that is not the one you know. The famous one shows Rhodes or Malta, a compact island fortress. The real operating map was a spiderweb across Europe, priories and bailiwicks subdivided into commanderies, sometimes just called houses, each with rents, tithes, mills, ovens, stalls, fisheries, and rites of passage. In France, Provence, and Auvergne, in Aragon and Castile, in Italy's patchwork principalities, in the Holy Roman Empire's tangle of jurisdictions, in England, Scotland, and Ireland, before Tudor confiscations, in Poland and Hungary, in the Low Countries, everywhere lay parcels pledged to St. John. Some were grand rural domains, others a single urban lot with a shop beneath a rented room, none on its own paid for a fleet. Together, disciplined by the same rules, they did. The Lange, the order's great tongues, or national groupings, were the architecture that made this sprawl governable. Each Lange encompassed several priories. Each priory oversaw a constellation of commanderies. The commander-preceptor ran the local house much like an abbot runs a monastery, or a bailiff, a seigneurial estate. He collected rents, enforced rights in local courts, maintained buildings, set leases, and, crucially, sent responsions, fixed annual dues up the chain toward the convent, the central house at Jerusalem, then Acre, then Rhodes, then Malta. The figure was not improvised. Chapters general set rates, visitors reviewed arrears, and the receiver of the common treasure at the centre tracked the whole flow against budgets, voted in chapter. The order could be generous with the sick, because it was ungentle with commanders who came up short. Papal privilege underwrote this economy. The order sat under a suite of bulls that, across the High and Late Middle Ages, confirmed three crucial immunities: exemption from local tithes on its own lands, freedom from many episcopal jurisdictions, the order answered directly to the Holy See, and liberty from certain civic imposts and tolls when moving goods for its work. That triad did not end dispute. Bishops and town councils are not famous for letting revenue walk, but it gave hospitaller procurators leverage. They arrived with parchment, precedent, and lawyers trained to cite chapter and canon in the same breath. If needed, they appealed to Rome. If that failed or cost too much time, they negotiated half rents, limited tolls, pledges to maintain local bridges, or contribute to town fortifications. The aim was constant: keep the pipeline oiled without bleeding goodwill. The commander's day looked like any serious land steward's. He inspected vineyards after hail, weighed grain at the mill, sat in court to hear a tenant's complaint against the reeve, hired a mason to repair a roof, renewed a lease timed to St. John's feast. He also ran a hospice if the commandery stood on a road of real traffic, a refectory for the poor on certain days, a ward with a handful of beds, a chapel kept in decent repair. Statutes specified the number of poor to be fed on great feasts, and how much bread and wine they should receive. The spadework of mercy and the arithmetic of rent were not two jobs but one office. When the visitor arrived unannounced, he expected to see the ledger, the granary, the linen chest, and the chapel all in tolerable order. Proofs of nobility, the later requirement for certain classes of profession, fit into this economy as social glue. In many languages, a man who sought to become a knight of justice, professed under vows, had to show quarterings, documented noble ancestry by a set number of lines. You can mistake that for mere snobbery. It was also a governance hack. In a world where enforcement in distant places is expensive, you bind local elites to your rule by making their sons' honour depend upon your paperwork. Their families defended your rents because your insignia adorned their coffers and funerary slabs. Alongside the professed ran other classes, serving brothers, confrères and consoeurs, later knights and dames of obedience, whose promises, if not vows, added muscle and money without swelling the choir beyond what a house could spiritually sustain. The order's law, its rules, statutes and constitutions rewritten across centuries, provided the grammar for conflict. Commanders were not princes, they were office holders who could be recalled for cause. If they skimmed rents, neglected buildings, or refused to transmit responsions, they faced fines and removal. Priors who protected delinquents risked a visitor's wrath, and in bad cases, a chapter's discipline. The convent kept lists. Men who made a habit of being late or creative went without promotion. Conversely, a commander who turned around a failing estate and met his dues won reputation that translated into election to larger charges. In a Europe of personal ties, the order built an impersonal memory, minutes, receipts, and seals that outlived anyone's charm. Finance at the centre was a different craft. The receiver of the Common Treasure Office, with a name fit for epic, was the order's CFO in an era before spreadsheets. He forecast revenue from responsions, priced grain and timber in multiple markets, hedged against a bad harvest in Burgundy with a surplus in Apulia, and carried cash across frontiers where coinage changed every 2 days' ride. At Rhodes and Malta, he bought powder, rope, sailcloth, iron, meat, oil, wine, candles, and the 1,000 expendables the convent devoured. He paid stipends, shored up a failing priory with a loan, redeemed a captive when honour required, and kept a reserve for siege. A negligent receiver starved a ward, a prudent one made a fortress last a month longer. Coinage made the order's sovereignty tangible. On Malta the order struck money, scudi, tari, grani with its arms. This was not vanity. Paying crews and contractors in familiar coin smooths supply. Stamping your cross on the medium of daily life signals jurisdiction to merchants and peasants alike. The mint also enforced standards in a market where clipped and debased coins circulated. In the same spirit the order ran law courts, the Castellania in Valletta being the most visible, where civil and criminal matters within its competence were tried under a mix of Roman law, canon law and the order's statutes. A litigant saw robed judges beneath the 8-pointed cross. Merchants learned the local weight and measure tables. Notaries wrote in formulas that bound promises to penalties. Sovereignty is procedures that everyone learns by heart. Maritime law and practice were their own subsystem. Letters of marque and reprisal, capitulations with allied states, convoy schedules, prize courts. The order sat inside the Mediterranean's shared, and often shared in bad faith, rules. When an enemy or pirate was taken, a prize court judged hull, cargo, and the fate of captives under statutes that tried, not always successfully, to keep profit from turning men feral. Shares were allocated by rule: the convent, the captain, officers, crew, and the wounded according to injury. Out of that arithmetic came discipline at sea. Men fight for a prize when they trust the distribution. Men mutiny when they do not. The order learnt that lesson early and wrote it down. Diplomacy lubricated everything. The Hospitallers maintained permanent envoys, or frequent agents at courts, that mattered: the Papal Curia, the Habsburg and Valois Bourbon courts, Venice and lesser princes, whose roads crossed the order's supply lines. Envoys argued tax breaks and safe conducts. They pleaded for convoys and escorts. They asked to recruit in regions where a king's pride could be pricked by another's banner. They delivered something in return, a credible promise that the order would use its neutrality to heal that king's wounded without sniffing after souls, and that its galleys would not suddenly prey upon his merchants under cover of piety. In an era when most international law was a mix of etiquette and threats, the order provided one of the few institutions that kept files, who promised what, when, with which seals, and could produce them when memories went selective. The Reformation fractured this entire architecture and forced improvisation. In England, Henry VIII's dissolution of religious houses swept away the Hospitallers' lands and houses. A brief Marian restoration flickered. Elizabethan settlement closed the door. The English lingo effectively collapsed. Properties were alienated. A centuries-old revenue stream vanished. In parts of the Empire and the Low Countries, princes adopted Lutheran or Reformed confessions and seized or rechartered Hospitaller properties. Some houses became Protestant chivalric orders that kept the banner of St. John but no longer recognised the Roman Grand Master. The bailiwick of Brandenburg, later the Johanniterorden, is the clearest example. It reoriented under Protestant rulers and developed its own charitable and honorific life. In the Dutch Republic, the bailiwick of Utrecht took a similar path. These bodies did real good: hospitals, ambulances, later the famous St. John ambulance tradition in the Anglophone world, but they did it outside the Roman obedience. From Rome's point of view, that was loss. From the historians, it is diversification under pressure. In Catholic realms, reforming monarchs and ministers still bit deep. The Bourbon and Habsburg states, eager to rationalise their finances, pressed the order to contribute more, supervise less, or accept national oversight. Enlightened absolutists distrusted immunities. Josephinist policies in parts of the Habsburg lands scrutinised every privilege. In France, royal councils increasingly treated commanderies as local benefices subject to crown interests, and the Revolution finally confiscated most church and order property outright, late 1780s. The order weathered many storms by legal dexterity. It could not negotiate with a revolution that abolished its premises. Chapter 7 told how the order transformed after 1798. The road to that transformation runs through a Europe where, estate by estate, the ground was pulled out from under the convent's budgets. The order's internal reforms across the 17th and 18th centuries should be read as attempts to keep the web taut despite political slack. Chapters general tightened visitations, standardized account books, clarified what a commander could spend locally without prior approval, and curbed abuses that had crept in during long peace. One sees in the minutes an organisation aware that complacency is the predator that sieges fail to be. Recruitment rules hardened and softened in cycles, balancing the desire for noble recruits who bring prestige and protection against the need for men who can actually run a dockyard or a hospital. Proofs were enforced unevenly by langargues. Exceptions were granted for merit or for a prince's insistence. Real life never fits clean lines. The order kept trying to keep the lines visible. Women's participation ran through this web more deeply than a casual reader expects. Female confraternities and later formalised groups of dames endowed beds, managed urban hospices, and in some regions held the purse strings that kept small commanderies alive. In several cities, the face of St. John on market day was a woman collecting for the poor under the order's cross, with authority from a prior and the respect of notaries who knew exactly where her receipts would go. When the modern era opened, those female associations proved to be seeds that could sprout even where male religious houses were suppressed. If you want to know how memory crosses a legal chasm, follow the women who kept cooking, nursing and fundraising under altered paperwork. Litigation was not failure, it was maintenance. The order sued and was sued in secular and ecclesiastical courts. It contested a bishop's claim to visit a house. It defended a tenant against a rapacious local lord to preserve its reputation among peasants. It argued over water rights because a mill's flow decided whether the commandery could send responsions that year. It lost and won, and it kept records of both. The case file, the instrument, became, oddly, a spiritual document. By writing down the ugly details, the order taught its officers to live with that ugliness in daylight instead of in rumour. Nothing protects a treasury like the knowledge that a court may someday read your figures aloud. All of this sounds prosaic until you put it back on the sea road. A Polish commandery's wheat, converted to florins, became sailcloth in Genoa. A vineyard in Languedoc, pressed into wine, became ration at Rhodes. A lease payment from a German market stall became powder in Valletta. A Catalan mill's rent became a surgeon's stipend. When a siege closed, it held because dozens of unseen harvests had been weighed honestly and sent on time. When a hospital reached for more linen at dawn, the chest held it because a commander 1,000 miles away said no to a cousin's temporary loan 3 years earlier. People like to talk about honour. In this world, honour looked like a reconciled ledger. The order's festivals and decorations, the white cross on black, the scarlet mantles of high officers, the carved arms over a city gate, were not mere vanity in this economy, they were technology. Symbols turned a diffuse body into a felt presence. A tenant paid on time because the cross on the charter matched the cross he saw on feast days. A donor gave because he wanted his memory carved on a hospital wall, beneath a seal that would still be recognised when his great-grandchildren forgot his first name. A prince refrained from plundering a priory because he needed the order's flag to pass customs 2 years from now. People obey stories when the story keeps its props in place. The hospitallers curated their props, arms, mottos, ceremonies with the same care they gave to barns and barrels. Criticisms are easy to make and often fair. Some commanders treated commanderies as perches for comfort. Some langs defended privileges past prudence. Faction, especially along French and Spanish lines in the 18th century, could distort appointments and strategy, and the order's participation in the Mediterranean economy of captivity and forced labour stained its record. Even as its hospitals mitigated that economy's worst effects for the wounded, all of those faults belong in the file. What also belongs is the through line. When the order was most itself, the distant estate was run as if the convent depended on it because it did. By the late 18th century, the model had reached its limit. States centralising under enlightened ministers or revolutionary assemblies could no longer be bargained with by parchment alone. The suppressions and confiscations that followed stripped the order's European web to threads, yet the habits built over 6 centuries did not vanish. They were carried by men and women, by minutes and manuals, into a new configuration where land mattered less, donors more, where responsions became subsidies and grants, where the receiver's ledgers resembled a modern NGO's budget, where commanderies reappeared as national associations with audited accounts and boards. Chapter 7 described that metamorphosis. Chapter 11 explains why it was possible, because the order had taught itself, for generations, that a promise written down and kept on time is the only miracle you can schedule. Stand again on the ramparts at Burgul, or in the long hall of the Sacra Infermeria, and imagine the path backward from the cannon, or the bed to the rye field in Lorraine, or the olive grove near Syracuse that paid for them. The sound you hear beneath the clash and the prayer is a quieter rhythm. Quills, scales, footsteps in a vineyard, grain poured from sack to bin, the snap of a seal on a letter to the receiver, the murmur of a visitor reading a ledger and nodding because the numbers match. That, more than any single victory, is how the White Cross endured. Not by luck, not by myth, by estates and commanderies, by a law that made mercy solvable, by a web strong enough to pull distant harvests to a single table where the poor could be fed and the sick could be served. If you peel back the stone from every Hospitaller story, Jerusalem's wards, Rhodes' bastions, Malta's long hall, you find a handful of durable claims that have outlived each address. The order said, and keeps saying, we are a religious body under rule. We are sovereign enough to move help across borders. We bind rank to responsibility. We convert property into care. We make mercy predictable. The last chapter ends where the archive is still being written. A brotherhood that once fought with awe and culverin now maneuvers with legal personality, neutral flags, first aid schools, and clinics that open faster than ministries can draft decrees. To close this history, we have to put each of the order's old components, vow, law, land, ship, hospital, into their modern equivalents, and name what actually endured, what broke, and what became something new, without pretending it was the same. Start with sovereignty. The order's modern sovereignty is not the medieval possession of an island defended by bombards. It is a compact, recognized subject of international law, with extraterritorial seats in Rome, accredited missions, passports and license plates that function, and a diplomatic network built to open corridors for aid. This is not costume. Hospitals, pharmaceuticals and field teams move faster when they travel under a legal personality that customs officers, border police and health ministries already understand. The magistral palaces provide the symbol, bilateral and multilateral relations supply the channels, a law of privileges and immunities, the same family of law that secures the Red Cross or UN agencies, keeps the ambulance from being treated as a taxable truck at a frontier. If medieval sovereignty was walls, modern sovereignty is the signed paper that makes a corridor behave like a road even when there is no road. Vows have changed less than people assume. The first-class professed knights who live the evangelical councils under the order's rule remain the spiritual engine of the body. They do not dominate numbers, they shape temperature. Their prayer rhythms, their corporate penances after institutional failures, their role in electing leadership and guarding continuity, these make the enterprise more than a logistics firm with tasteful heraldry. Alongside them, knights and dames in obedience, chaplains, volunteers, doctors, pharmacists, logisticians, donors, these knit the body to the scale of today's need. The old question, who commands whom when the ward is full, has a modern answer learned by repetition. Spiritual authority frames the mission, but professional competence runs the floor. The ritual does not compete with the ventilator, it teaches the hands moving it why they must be calm. Rank survived because it kept learning to explain itself. In the fortress era, it was obvious why a Grand Master, a Grand Hospitaller, and a receiver of the common treasure were indispensable. A city under bombardment is a civics lesson. In a world of ambulances and memos, rank can look like theatre until a week of flood or a month of epidemic shows what hierarchy is for. Someone must authorize the spend without dithering. Someone must decide which partner to trust when rumours outpace verifications. Someone must carry the political heat for decisions made at speed. The Sovereign Council, the Grand Chancellor's diplomatic service, the Grand Hospitaler's operational chain, the receivership's budget discipline. These now decide whether a 40-foot container clears port in time for a measles campaign or sits until the vaccines die under the sun. The 8-pointed cross kept its catechesis. It still teaches beatitudes to people who think they only signed up to drive a van. But the cross also became a brand in the best sense of that word, a guarantee that a certain floor of competence and ethic will follow wherever it appears. That is a remarkable pivot for a medieval insignia. Many old banners are now only weekend costumes. The Hospitaller cross is on scrub shirts, data collection tablets, training manuals, and MOUs with interior ministries. The insignia makes neutral space in rooms that would otherwise be warred by symbols. It unfreezes meetings. In the worst hours of a disaster, a white cross on black, its edges now stylized, its points crisp, tells a tired official that this visitor is here to lift weight, not to steal cameras. Hospitals as buildings matter less than hospital as method. The order runs hospitals, clinics, and specialty programs. It also inserts medical capacity into places where the building is a tent, a church hall, a school classroom. The long hall of the Sacra Infermeria is transposed into modular wards, triage flow under pop-up lighting, and cold chain refrigerators humming off generators whose fuel supply is planned in litres per patient day. The dietary statutes of Jerusalem matured into nutrition programs that pair food parcels with antenatal visits. The Lazaretto's smoked letters became infection control protocols, border health advisories, and respectful coordination with public health authorities who must balance disease control with lawful movement. The pharmacy shelves, once stacked with myrrh and galangal, are now formularies negotiated to keep insulin, oxytocin, antibiotics, and antiretrovirals flowing at sustainable prices. What the order always understood, that mercy must be procedural to scale, now becomes a datum. Every hour saved by a pre-cleared customs form is an infant spared a hypoxic night in a rural clinic. Quarantine, once a harbour architecture, is now a stance. In epidemics, the order does not preach, it executes. Triage tents outside clinics, separate flows for respiratory and non-respiratory complaints, rapid training modules translated overnight, supply lists that assume tomorrow's road may be cut, a duty roster that prevents heroics from burning out the reliable. It takes humility, not romance, to run a cholera response in heat, while preventing secondary infections at the latrine line. The old lazaretto taught patience by making ships wait 40 days. The new lazaretto is a whiteboard where a nurse writes the donning order for PPE and refuses to shorten it, even when the queue grows. Money, the most prosaic piece of the medieval machine, became the crucible of credibility in the modern one. Medieval responsions from far estates turned into audited budgets, grant compliance, procurement law, and anti-corruption controls that are boring, the correct adjective by design. Donors, states, foundations, companies, parish guilds, generous families do not give to institutions that cannot show what a euro buys in syringes, litres of fuel, nights of lodging, or hours of home care. The receivership's ledgers once balanced rents and prize shares. Now they reconcile multi-currency inflows with restrictions that cannot be broken without killing the trust that keeps the entire economy of mercy alive. A modern receiver must be able to look a board in the eye and show where every coin went, including the ones spent on the oversight itself. Diplomacy is less glamorous than chroniclers make it sound, and more decisive than critics like to admit. A memorandum that gets a convoy through a checkpoint at dusk is more strategic than 1,000 press releases. The order's ambassadors, some career, some seconded from national associations, some volunteers with unusual resumes, visit ministries not to posture, but to ask for the specific permissions that turn a plan into a delivery schedule, radio frequencies for ambulances, exemptions from Sunday trucking bans for vaccine deliveries, recognition of medical qualifications across borders for volunteers brought in to reinforce a clinic. When that work goes well, nobody hears of it. When it fails, you read about delays without knowing which missing stamp killed a child at midnight. The Order's ecumenical mirror is not an embarrassment, it is a complicated gift. Protestant and Anglican continuations of the St. John tradition, Johanniter and the Venerable Order of St. John, and their ambulance networks, do not obey Rome's Grand Master, but they share a grammar of practical mercy with the same patron's name on the lintel. Sometimes they cooperate in the field, often they parallel each other in different legal and cultural ecologies. Historians who like clean lines complain about the tangle, the poor do not. A first aid post at a marathon, a rural ambulance service, a disaster response team after a storm. These are not doctrinal negotiations, they are convergences of trained reflex. The medieval split into langs, which prevented the order from being captured by one crown, now looks like a precedent for a family of cousins who can disagree on polity while agreeing that gloves go on before the wound is touched. Controversy belongs in the ledger. because institutions that live long injure themselves as well as being struck. Governance crises flare, reforms reset constitutions, relations with the Holy See can turn from cordial to corrective. When leadership errs, critics ask whether a vowed first-class small in number should hold decisive weight. Defenders reply that without a vowed heart, the body will become another NGO that forgets why it must do the hard things when applause stops. These fights matter because they decide whether the next decade will be spent in courtrooms or clinics. The Order's better cycles have always ended with the same sober arithmetic: clarify authority, publish rules, widen competence, and get back to work. The worst cycles ended in memoirs and interviews, the best ended in new training schools, stronger protection for whistleblowers, and faster procurement rules that do not tempt upright men and women to cut corners under deadline. Training turned from apprenticeship into an industry, and rightly so. First aid once learned at a wardside is now a course delivered to teenagers, bus drivers, parish volunteers, and soldiers who have to learn tourniquets as a civic skill. The Order's associations teach the public to keep each other alive long enough for professionals to arrive. That is a theological statement disguised as pedagogy. Your neighbour's life is partly your responsibility. Advanced courses turn nurses into field leaders, logisticians into the people you really want in charge of a warehouse, and administrators into the adults who say no to seductive projects with no budget lines for fuel. A good training pipeline is a recruitment tool, a retention strategy, and a public catechism that repeats in secular language what the rule teaches in prayer. Discipline saves. Technology did not change the vow, it made it more exacting. Electronic medical records in a refugee camp protect continuity and dignity if built to respect privacy and interoperability. Satellite imagery helps site clinics where roads and floods actually are, rather than where maps say they used to be. Cold chain monitors text an alert when a refrigerator warms at 0312. Inventory systems prevent the showy mistake of having a surgeon without sutures. Yet the Order's style resists gadget worship. Tools are adopted when they increase reliability, not because they look modern in a donor deck. The best compliment the Order can receive from a partner ministry is still the quiet one. They do what they promise, and their data are clean. Law remains the cage and the shield. Humanitarian principles, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence, are not slogans attached to glossy brochures. They are the predicts the Order asserts in letters of agreement and the boundaries it holds in the field when authority is tempted to misuse a clinic for intelligence or a convoy for patronage. The Order's religious character can be an asset in cultures that distrust secular NGOs. It can be a liability in others, unless the leadership insists, as the vow requires that sacraments are offered, never traded, and that patients' autonomy is real. That insistence is why the Order can operate in plural societies without lying about itself. It welcomes partners' rules, it keeps its own. The legacy question, which version of the Order will history remember, is easier than polemic suggests. If you define the real Hospitallers as the men who fought in the Aegean or faced Suleiman's guns, you miss the institution's deeper identity and, ironically, its best strategic brain. The Order always won by logistics and institutional memory. The great battles are readable because they were exceptions. The daily work is what kept the exceptions survivable. A system that turns wheat in Brabant into broth on the Grand Harbour, or a bequest in Barcelona into linen in Jerusalem, is a system that will survive the fall of fortresses if someone saves the ledgers and the habit of keeping them. The modern Order did exactly that. It swapped estates for audited donors, prize courts for procurement, bastions for legal privileges, galleys for ambulances, and the long ward for a network of clinics. The grammar is the same: see, count, prepare, serve, review, repent, repeat. What breaks next will be predictable. Demography will strain volunteer pools. Geopolitics will turn neutral corridors into bargaining chips. Public health controversies will test the Order's ability to remain trusted by people who suspect anyone who wears a cross, or anyone who receives a grant. The answer is not secrecy or vague talk. It is the very discipline this history has narrated. Precise promises, exact execution, polite insistence on the order's remit, and a capacity to tell the truth about failures before others must. Institutions with sacraments have a built-in tool for that: confession. When it becomes administrative as well as spiritual, when audits are treated as penance and reforms as acts of contrition, you get the strange, resilient culture the Hospitallers at their best embody. Humble in the ward, flinty in the ledger, stubborn at the negotiating table, and absolutely indifferent to applause when the stretcher is moving. Symbols teach the public while they train the body. The 8 points still catechize recruits in the Beatitudes, or in other traditional readings. Spiritual armour fashioned into geometric pedagogy. The black mantle still tells a city that an old promise has returned. Decorations and grades. Grand Cross, Commander Knight can be misused as vanity. They can also be used as instruments of accountability when they are tied to work done, standards met, clinics built, and nights kept without complaint. Ceremonies, investitures, masses, processions are not the work, but they are the tuning before the work. A choir that sings together on Saturday tends to staff a clinic on Sunday without splintering under small insults. There is a practical test for legacy. Who thanks you when no one is watching? The Order's quiet reputation with emergency physicians, firefighters, border police, parish nurses, and mayors of small towns is the proof that this medieval creation still pays its dues. These are the people who call an association chair at 0410 because a bus overturned or a river cut new channels in the night. They do not call unless they have learned, by repetition, that the cross on a van means the next hour will get simpler. Historical memory is nice. Muscle memory saves lives. So the afterlife of a crusading order looks in the end nothing like an afterlife. It is a different life for the same vow. The order did not preserve itself by pretending to be what it was in 1565. It preserved itself by asking every decade what parts of 1565 were essence and what parts were accident. Essence, rule, right, ranks tied to duty, finances tied to mercy, the hospital as method, sovereignty as the freedom to serve, accident, the shape of the cannon, the fashion of the hull, the exact form of the ledger. You can change accidents without betraying essence. You must, or the essence will die with the fashion. Walk, then, one last time through the long hall in Valletta, and imagine it transposed into a clinic in a gymnasium after an earthquake, a mother and child centre under a tin roof at a desert edge, a mobile dental van on the outskirts of a capital where the poor work 6 days and lose teeth for lack of Wednesday appointments. The same sequence recurs: receive, wash, feed, treat, record, review, and return tomorrow. A knight in a black cape and a volunteer in a reflective vest are performing the same liturgy with different vestments. They will make mistakes, they will correct them, they will argue about constitutions and go back to work. Their enemies will be cholera and indifference more often than ships under a green flag. Their allies will be anyone who agrees that the sick are not a bargaining chip. History's last courtesy to the Hospitallers is not a statue or a postage stamp. It is the stubborn admission, even from critics, that an institution founded to shelter pilgrims and the poor in a city most of its current members will never see, has for 9 centuries kept a competence others borrow when the hour is bad. That competence is not charisma. It is a rule, rewritten without being emptied, a right, translated without being dulled, a rank structure, humbled into service, a sovereignty defined as corridors not crowns, and a hospital, learned until it became second nature. The cross keeps appearing on an ambulance caught in dawn traffic, on a clipboard where a nurse signs for a vaccine batch, on a gate where a warehouse guard waves a truck through because the words on the letterhead are the ones he has been told to trust. That is the real monument. Not Rhodes, not Valletta, not any bastion, splendid though they are. The monument is a habit of mercy that learned to speak law, a choir that learned to speak logistics, a vow that learned to drive at night. If the order can keep that habit honest, rule observed, money counted, promises kept, its history does not end, it simply keeps its hour.